She was 8 years old, completely blind, and she had never walked toward a stranger on her own. Not once. Not in 8 years. But that night, in a restaurant full of people, Lila Sterling stood up from her mother's table, let go of the only hand she had ever trusted, and walked across the room toward a man she had never met. Her mother, one of the wealthiest women in the city, sat frozen, unable to move, unable to explain what she was watching. Because Lila didn't stumble. She didn't hesitate. She walked directly to his table like she already knew him. And when that little girl gently touched the empty chair and asked a stranger if she could sit beside him, everything changed. For all of them. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people who find each other in the most unexpected places. If this story moves you, give it a like, and drop a comment below telling us what city and country you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to that restaurant. Because what happened next is something none of them will ever forget. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon. By 7 o'clock, it was coming down in sheets, running in dark rivers along the gutters of Meridianson Street, and drumming against the tall windows of Harlow's, one of those restaurants that didn't advertise because it didn't need to. Kind of place where the lighting was always low, and the tablecloths were always white, and the people sitting at them had usually made enough money that they didn't have to think about the price of things anymore. Ethan Carter had never eaten at a place like Harlow's before. He sat at a corner table, his back to the wall, a habit so deeply wired into him that he didn't even think about it anymore, and studied the menu with the careful attention of a man who wasn't actually reading it. He was aware of the exits. He was aware of the couple arguing in low voices 3 tables over, and the busboy who kept dropping silverware near the kitchen door, and the faint sound of jazz coming through the speakers somewhere above him, competing with the rain. He was always aware. That never shut off. After 12 years of it, he wasn't sure it ever would. The menu was too expensive for what he'd budgeted this month, but his truck needed brake pads, and Noah's school had a field trip coming up that cost $40, and Ethan had already said yes before he'd looked at his bank account. He'd figure it out. He always figured it out. What he hadn't figured out was why he'd let his coworker Marcus talk him into coming here in the first place. It's your birthday, man. You're turning 37. You can't eat a frozen pizza on your birthday. Marcus hadn't shown up. He'd texted 20 minutes ago. Something came up with Jenny, man. I'm sorry. Rain check? Ethan had stared at the message for a moment and then put his phone face down on the table and picked up the menu again. It was fine. He was used to eating alone. There was a version of a man who would have been angry about it, but Ethan wasn't really that version anymore. He'd left most of his anger in places he didn't name out loud. He ordered the cheapest thing that still sounded like a real meal, a grilled chicken dish with roasted vegetables and a glass of water, and he sat back and let himself exist quietly in the noise of other people's evenings. He was good at being invisible. He'd been trained to be. Vivian Sterling had not planned to bring Lila here tonight. The original plan had been takeout and a movie on the couch, which was Lila's preferred Friday night, and, if Vivian was being honest, her own preferred Friday night too. But the investor dinner she'd been dreading all week had been rescheduled for Monday, which meant the babysitter she'd hired was no longer needed, which meant Lila was with her, and Lila had heard her on the phone with the restaurant and said, very quietly, "Can I come?" Vivian had hesitated. She always hesitated. That was the thing she hated most about herself, this constant internal calculation she ran every time her daughter asked for something ordinary. Can I come? A simple question. A question any 8-year-old might ask. But Vivian's brain was always already 3 steps ahead. The crowded room, the unfamiliar voices, the server who might not realize Lila couldn't see and might set something down in a place she wouldn't expect, the other diners who might stare. Mom Lila's voice had been patient, the way it was often patient with her. I'll be okay. So they came. Lila sat across from her now, her small hands folded in her lap, her head tilted at the slight angle she always had when she was mapping a new space, listening to the distance between sounds, building a picture out of frequencies and echoes and the direction of moving air. She did it the way other children might look around a room. Just quietly, steadily taking it all in. She was wearing a yellow dress that she'd chosen herself that morning by touching each item in her closet and asking Vivian which one felt right for Rain. Vivian had described the options, and Lila had picked yellow without a second thought. And Vivian had thought not for the first time that her daughter understood things about the world that she was only beginning to learn. "The music is old," Lila said. Vivian looked up from the menu. "What?" "The music. It's from a long time ago. The instruments sound different from new music." She paused. "It's nice. It's jazz," Vivian said. "Your grandmother loved jazz." Lila considered that. What does jazz feel like? It was the kind of question that Vivian never quite knew how to answer. She tried anyway. Like a conversation between people who are all talking at the same time, but somehow not interrupting each other. Lila seemed to like that. She nodded once, settling deeper into her chair. Food arrived. Vivian watched Lila's hands move carefully over the edge of the table, finding her water glass, then her fork, then the bread plate, cataloging the landscape of their small table with practiced ease. She'd been doing this since she was 4. She was efficient at it now, unhurried, and she never looked frustrated. Vivian was the one who got frustrated. Vivian was the one who reached over to help before Lila asked. And Lila would say gently, "Always gently, I've got it, Mom." The dinner was going well, and then Lila went still. Not the quiet stillness of listening. Something different. Something more focused. Her head turned slightly, angling toward the back corner of the restaurant, and her brow furrowed in the way it did when she was concentrating very hard on a single sound. "Lila?" Vivian said. Her daughter didn't answer right away. Vivian turned and looked toward the corner, but there was nothing unusual there. Just a man eating alone, somewhere in his mid-30s maybe. Dark hair, a little rough around the edges, a simple button-down shirt. He wasn't doing anything interesting, he was just eating, one hand resting on the table, looking at the window and the rain. When Vivian looked back, Lila had put down her fork. "He's alone," Lila said. "What, the man in the corner?" Her voice was certain, not questioning. "He's eating by himself." Vivian looked again. "A lot of people eat by themselves, sweetheart." "Not like that," Lila said. She couldn't explain it any better than that. She just sat for a moment, and then before Vivian understood what was happening, Lila pushed back her chair. Lila, but her daughter was already standing. She was already moving. Ethan noticed her about 5 steps before she reached him. He noticed everything. It was the same involuntary radar that had kept him alive in places where the consequences of not paying attention were immediate and permanent. So when a small figure began making its way through the tables, without hesitation, without anyone guiding her, he tracked it. Tracked her. He noticed the way she navigated without sight, using the sound of other diners, the vibration of the floor, slight changes in ambient noise to gauge distance and direction. He noticed that she wasn't stumbling or guessing she was reading the room with something he could only describe as precision. He'd worked with trained military navigators who couldn't do it that cleanly. And then she was beside his table, close enough that he could see her eyes light brown, unfocused, still and understood immediately that she couldn't see him. She was maybe 8. Yellow dress, dark hair pulled back. Her hands were loose at her sides, relaxed, which surprised him. He'd expected anxiety. Kids her age were usually nervous around strangers, even when they could see them. She didn't look nervous at all. She reached out and touched the back of the empty chair, across from him, one gentle, deliberate contact, just to confirm it was there, and then she looked up in his direction, her face tipped slightly toward the sound of his breathing. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was very calm. "Could I eat dinner with you?" Ethan stared at her. He had no response prepared for this. He had responses prepared for most things. This wasn't one of them. He started and then stopped. He looked across the restaurant, trying to locate where she'd come from, and found a woman standing between 2 tables, stock still, staring at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read somewhere between alarm and something else, something that hadn't resolved itself yet. He looked back at the girl. "Sure," he said, because he couldn't think of a single reason to say anything else. He pulled out the chair, giving it a slight scrape so she could track the sound, and said, "There's always room at the table." She sat down like she'd been invited. No fuss. No ceremony. She folded her hands in front of her with the easy confidence of a child who had decided something and was content with the decision. And then Vivian arrived. She came quickly, her heels sharp against the hardwood, her face set in the careful expression of someone who was mortified but was trying not to show it in front of her daughter. "I am so sorry," she said, the words coming out in a low, controlled rush. She's never done this before. She's not. I don't know why she do. It's fine, Ethan said. He meant it. Vivian looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time. The way she would have looked at a risk assessment, quickly but thoroughly, cataloging what was there. He didn't look alarmed. He didn't look annoyed. He was just sitting there quietly like a child. Appearing at his table was a thing that happened, and he didn't have any particular problem with it. "Lila," Vivian said softer now. "Come back to our table, honey." "I want to eat here," Lila said. "Not just clear." Vivian opened her mouth and closed it again. Ethan watched this exchange without comment. He could see what was happening. He could see the mother trying to calibrate, trying to figure out if this was a battle worth having, trying to understand what had gotten into her daughter, trying to assess him at the same time. She was doing 3 things at once and doing all of them carefully, which told him a lot about her. "I could bring your food over," he offered, "if you wanted to sit here. Both of you. I've got more room than I need." Vivian looked at the table. He had a point. The corner table was bigger than he needed for one person. She looked at Lila, who was sitting in the chair like she'd been born in it. "Please, Mom." Vivian exhaled something that wasn't quite a sigh. She sat down. The first 10 minutes were awkward. Vivian wasn't a person who was comfortable with awkward silences. She spent most of her professional life managing rooms, managing conversations, reading people, and redirecting them. But this was different, because she couldn't figure out what to do with this man. He wasn't performing politeness. He wasn't filling the silence with nervous small talk. He just sat there, eating his dinner, and when Lila asked him something, he answered it. And when Lila didn't ask anything, he didn't push. It was Lila who drove the conversation. She always did. "What do the windows look like?" she asked him. Ethan glanced at the tall windows beside them, running with rain. "Blurry," he said, "like someone took everything outside and smeared it. Streetlights make orange blobs. Cars going by make bright lines that disappear fast." "Do you like rain?" He thought about it for a moment, which Lila noticed. She always noticed when someone actually thought about a question instead of just answering it. "Sometimes," he said. "I like the sound. I don't like driving in it." "Me neither," Lila said, even though she didn't drive, and somehow that made Vivian want to smile. "What's the loudest thing in here?" Lila asked. Ethan listened. "Couple over by the door," he said. "They keep dropping silverware. Going on their 4th time now." Lila laughed a real laugh, sudden and bright. "I heard that. I thought it was the kitchen. No, it's definitely them. I think one of them is nervous. Why? The way they keep moving. People fidget when they're nervous. They knock things over." Lila considered this seriously. "What about you? Do you fidget?" "No. Why not?" "I spent a long time learning not to," he said, and left it there. Vivian watched him explain the room to her daughter, not in the cautious, simplified way that most adults talk to Lila, over-careful and slightly condescending, as if Lila's blindness also meant her mind needed protection. He just described things, plainly, the way he might describe them to anyone. He gave her the information and let her do whatever she wanted with it. Loved it. Vivian could see it happening in real time, her daughter opening up, leaning slightly forward in her chair, asking more questions, the slight tension that Lila always carried in unfamiliar spaces gradually dissolving. She didn't know what to do with that. She'd spent 8 years trying to create environments where Lila felt safe. She'd hired specialists and renovated their apartment and researched schools and created routines with the dedication of someone planning a long campaign. And this stranger, this man she'd known for 20 minutes, was achieving something with a few plain sentences that Vivian had been chasing for years. It made her feel grateful and useless at the same time. After a while, Lila asked the question directly. She did things like that. She asked things that most people would circle around for hours. "Why are you eating by yourself?" Ethan set down his fork. For a moment, Vivian thought he wasn't going to answer. He looked at the table in that way people do when they're deciding whether to be honest about something. My friend was supposed to come, he said. Couldn't make it. Do you eat alone a lot? A pause. More than I used to. Lila seemed to understand something in that answer. She didn't push further. She just nodded once, slowly, like she was filing it away. My dad doesn't eat with us anymore either, she said. He moved to London. Vivian stiffened slightly. I'm sorry to hear that, Ethan said. Mom says it's okay to feel sad about it. Your mom sounds right. Lila smiled. She usually is. She just worries too much. Vivian made a quiet sound that might have been protest. Most people who love someone a lot worry too much, Ethan said. He was looking at Vivian when he said it, just briefly, and she had the uncomfortable feeling of being seen by someone she hadn't given permission to look. She looked away first. The food came and went. The rain kept falling. At some point, without planning it, they had become three people having dinner together, instead of a stranger tolerating a child's intrusion, and Vivian couldn't exactly identify the moment when that had shifted. She ordered dessert for Lila, a chocolate thing with a name she couldn't pronounce, and Lila reached across the table to locate Ethan's coffee cup and asked if she could smell it, and he slid it toward her without making anything of it. She leaned over the rim and breathed in and said, "That smells like how being awake feels," and Ethan said, "That's the best description of coffee I've ever heard," and Lila beamed. Vivian asked him carefully what he did. "Mechanic," he said. "I work at a shop over on Calloway Street. You were in the military?" She hadn't meant to ask it so directly. He looked at her. "What gave it away? The way you sit," she said. "The way I don't know. The way you notice things." He considered that. "Navy," he said, long time ago. She didn't push further because she'd learned something in 8 years of managing people. When someone gives you just enough, they're telling you that's all you get. She respected that. "I run a company," she offered, because it felt like the exchange required something. Sterling Group. Real estate development, mostly. Some acquisitions. He nodded, without the usual reaction she got from people when they learned what she did, the sudden recalibration, the slight change in how they held themselves. He just nodded, the same way he'd nodded when she'd said anything else. "That sounds like a lot of work," he said. "It is. Do you like it?" She blinked. Nobody asked her that. Most of the time, she said yes. "Good," he said, simply, and went back to his coffee. When Lila finally started to fade, she always got quieter in that specific way. When she was tired, her questions slower, her head tipping slightly, Vivian asked for the check. Ethan reached for his wallet. "Please don't," Vivian said. "You let us invade your table. Dinner is the least I can do." He looked like he was going to argue. "Please," she said again. He didn't argue. Standing, gathering Lila's jacket, smoothing her daughter's hair back from her forehead, Vivian suddenly found herself saying something she hadn't planned to say. "We do this every few Fridays. Come out for dinner, I mean." She kept her voice neutral, like she was making a casual observation about the weather. "Lila likes trying new places. If you wanted to join us sometime. You and your son." She had remembered him mentioning a son, somewhere in the middle of explaining what the kitchen sounds like through a closed door. Ethan looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to do that," he said. Cold, just honest. "I know I don't," she said. "I'm asking because she liked talking to you." She tilted her head toward Lila, who was standing patiently beside her, already oriented toward the door. "That doesn't happen with everyone." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him actually thinking about it, which she appreciated. She'd learned to distrust people who said yes too fast. "I'll think about it," he said. She nodded and started to guide Lila toward the door. Then Lila turned back. She reached out, just reached out into the air behind her, and when her hand found Ethan's arm, she didn't make anything of it. She just gave it one small squeeze, the way you might say goodbye to someone you'd known for years rather than hours. Then she let go and walked out into the rain with her mother. Ethan stood at the corner table in a restaurant that was emptying out for the night. He looked at the chair where she'd been sitting. He stood there for a long time. On the drive home, Lila was quiet for most of the ride, listening to the rain on the roof of the car and the rhythm of the windshield wipers. Then she said, "He's not okay." Vivian glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" The man. Ethan. Lila had remembered his name, even though Vivian didn't recall introducing them formally. Maybe she had. Maybe Lila had simply held on to it the way she held on to everything important. He's sad, but he tries not to be. Vivian didn't say anything for a moment. How do you know? She asked. Lila considered the question seriously. Outside, the rain fell, and the city moved past the windows in blurred rivers of light. Because, she said finally, that's what sad people sound like when they're trying really hard. Vivian looked at the road. She thought about the way he'd said more than I used to when Lila asked if he ate alone often. She thought about the pause before he answered not long, just a breath. The kind of breath a person takes when they're deciding whether honesty is worth the exposure. She thought about his face when Lila touched his arm on the way out. Yeah, Vivian said quietly, to nobody in particular. I think you're right. Lila leaned her head against the window and listened to the rain and said nothing else, and Vivian drove them home through the dark streets, while somewhere across the city a man sat alone at a corner table that was suddenly too quiet. He didn't call. Vivian hadn't expected him to. She'd given him her card at the end of the evening, slid it across the table when Lila wasn't paying attention, more out of reflex than anything else. The same way she handed cards to contractors and building managers and anyone else she might need to reach again someday. Professional habit dressed up as something personal. She'd told herself it was purely practical. If something had gone wrong, if Lila had said something inappropriate, if the man had felt uncomfortable and wanted to address it through some channel that didn't involve showing up at her door, he would have a number to call. That was what she told herself. The card sat somewhere in the pocket of a jacket she wasn't sure he'd kept, and a week went by, and then another, and Vivian went back to her life the way water goes back to its level after something disturbs it. Meetings, conference calls, Lila's school schedule, and her therapy appointments and her check-ins with the specialist at Meridian Children's Medical, who had been monitoring her condition since she was 3. The ordinary machinery of a life that was, by any external measure, very full. She didn't think about Ethan Carter. She told herself she didn't think about him. On the Thursday night of the second week, Lila asked at dinner if the man from the restaurant had called yet. Vivian set down her fork. No, Lila absorbed this without any visible disappointment. She picked up a piece of bread and felt around the edge of her plate for the butter dish. Why not? People get busy, sweetheart. He wasn't busy. He was eating alone on his birthday. Vivian looked up.
How do you know it was his birthday?
He said his friend was supposed to come but couldn't. People make plans for birthdays, and he seemed like the kind of person who doesn't make plans very often. Lila found the butter dish and spread butter on her bread with patient, practiced strokes. So it was probably his birthday. Vivian stared at her daughter. Maybe you should call him, Lila said. That's not really how it works. Why? Vivian opened her mouth to explain and then realized she didn't have a good answer. She was a woman who negotiated 9-figure real estate deals without blinking. She had fired executives twice her age and restructured failing companies and sat across conference tables from men who'd spent their careers trying to intimidate people like her. The idea that she couldn't make a phone call was absurd. And yet, I'll think about it, she said. Lila nodded as if that settled it and went back to her bread. Vivian called the following morning. She stood in her kitchen at 7:45 before her assistant started sending the day's briefings, before the city fully woke up, and dialed the number she'd gotten from the card she'd left on the table. She'd photographed it with her phone before she handed it to him. Another reflex, not something she was proud of, and waited while it rang 3 times. He picked up on the 4th ring. Yeah, his voice was rough with sleep or morning or both. This is Vivian Sterling, a pause, from Harlow's. 2 weeks ago. My daughter sat at your table and... I remember, he said. Of course he remembered. She pressed on. I wanted to ask if you and your son might want to join us for dinner. This Friday. I know it's short notice, but Lila's been asking. She stopped herself. She'd promised she wasn't going to lead with Lila. She'd told herself that twice this morning. I thought it might be nice, she finished, which sounded lame even to her. There was a silence on the other end. Not a hostile silence. Just the kind where someone was actually thinking. Where, he said. She picked a different restaurant. Somewhere less expensive, less formal, because she'd spent 2 weeks replaying the look on his face at Harlow's when he'd reached for the check, not embarrassment exactly. more like the particular discomfort of a person who understood the distance between what a place costs and what their budget is, and was quietly calculating. She didn't want him calculating. She wanted him comfortable enough to show up. The place she chose was called Domingo's, a corner spot on the south side of the city that had been there since the early 90s. All brick walls and mismatched chairs and a menu that changed depending on what the owner felt like cooking that week. The food was good in the way that food is good when someone actually cares about it rather than about presentation. She arrived early and chose a round table near the back. Round tables were better for Lila, no corners to miscalculate, no orientation required, just a smooth edge she could track with one hand. Ethan arrived at exactly 7, which told her something about him. He was wearing a flannel shirt and dark jeans and a jacket that had seen better years. He had a kid with him, a boy who was maybe 9 or 10, taller than she'd expected, with his father's dark coloring and the wary, observant quality of a child who had learned early to pay attention to rooms before committing to them. He stood at the entrance and scanned the restaurant the same way Ethan had systematically, without appearing to, and then followed his father inside. Noah Carter looked at Vivian Sterling and said, "Hi," the way children say hi when they're not sure yet if they need to be on their best behavior. "Hi," Vivian said. "I'm Vivian." "I know," Noah said. "Dad said you run a company." "I do." "What kind of company?" "Buildings, mostly. We buy them and fix them and sometimes build new ones." Noah considered this like it was mildly interesting but not remarkable. "My dad fixes things too," he said, "but smaller." Ethan put a hand on his son's shoulder, not a reprimanding grip, just a light, steady pressure. "Cars," he said. "I fix cars. Dad fixed our sink last week," Noah added. "And the stairs outside." The second step was loose. "Noah." "What?" She said she fixes buildings. Stairs are part of buildings. Vivian laughed before she could stop herself, and something in the room changed. Some tight, careful thing that had been holding itself at distance came a little looser. Lila appeared from the other side of the table. She'd been sitting there the whole time, listening, and said, "Noah?" The boy turned to look at her, and Vivian watched him absorb the fact of Lila's blindness, without making a production of it. He went still for just a second, recalibrating, the way children do when they encounter something new, and their brain needs a moment to update, and then he said, "Yeah."
Hi.
Lila's face was turned slightly toward his voice. "I'm Lila. I can't see." "Okay," Noah said, and that was it. That was the whole conversation about it. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down and picked up the menu and said, "What kind of food is this?" "I don't know," Lila said. "Mom said it changes." "That's weird." "I think it's nice. It's like a surprise." Noah looked at the menu. "I hate surprises." "Why?" He shrugged. "They're usually not good ones." Lila turned her head toward him, and Vivian, who had been watching all of this from across the table, saw her daughter do something she rarely did in the first 10 minutes of meeting someone. She smiled. Not the polite, careful smile she used with adults she didn't know. The real one. The slightly lopsided one. "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard," Lila said. Noah looked surprised for a moment. Then he laughed. Ethan met Vivian's eyes as across the table. Neither of them said anything. But Vivian felt something move in her chest, not quite relief, not quite emotion, but something adjacent to both. Like a door she hadn't known was closed, opening a small, careful inch. Dinner at Domingo's was louder and messier than Harlow's had been, and significantly better. The owner, a broad man named Felix, who wore the same apron every night and had apparently never heard that restaurants were supposed to be quiet, came out to describe what he'd made that evening in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. Noah listened to the description of the braised lamb with the intense focus of a child considering a financial investment, and then asked if there was anything without lamb, and Felix said of course, and brought him something with chicken that Noah ate with complete seriousness, as though assessing it. Ethan ordered the lamb. Vivian ordered the same thing, mostly because she couldn't concentrate enough to make a decision of her own. She was watching Lila and Noah. They had started talking the moment they sat down and hadn't really stopped. Noah, it turned out, was the kind of kid who narrated things not because he'd been taught to, but because his brain apparently processed the world better when he described it out loud. And Lila was the kind of kid who absorbed descriptions like they were water. They were well matched in a way that had nothing to do with anyone's planning. At some point, Noah started describing the other diners at nearby tables quietly, under his breath, with a running commentary that was more accurate than polite, and Lila listened with her chin in her hand and her eyes half closed, the way she did when she was making pictures from words. Table by the window. Noah murmured, "Man and a woman. The man keeps checking his phone, and the woman keeps pretending she's not annoyed about it." Lila pressed her lips together. "How do you know she's annoyed?" "She's tapping her water glass. Like this." He demonstrated with his own glass, a slow rhythmic tap. "My dad does that when he's waiting for someone to finish talking." Ethan looked up from his food. "I don't do that, Dad." "You do that." Ethan considered this for a moment, then went back to his lamb. Lila laughed. Vivian watched Ethan not smile his face doing that thing, where the muscles around his mouth moved slightly, but he didn't let it get all the way to an actual expression, and thought, for the first time, that she might actually like this person. Not in the careful, transactional way she liked most people she met through work. Not in the way she liked someone because they were useful or intelligent or well-positioned. Just liked him. The way you like someone who behaves consistently whether or not anyone is watching. She'd been lied to by enough people who were charming in rooms full of observers that she'd started to distrust charm entirely. Ethan Carter didn't seem to have much charm. What he had was steadiness, which in her experience was harder to fake. "Your son is good with her," she said, quietly enough that the kids wouldn't hear. Ethan glanced at Noah. "He's a good kid. Did you tell him about her before tonight?"
Yeah.
Told him she was blind. Told him not to make a big deal of it. That was it? That was it. He picked up his water glass. "Kids overthink things when you over-explain. I just gave him the fact and let him figure the rest out himself." Vivian looked at Noah, who was now describing the color of the walls, to Lila, with the casual dedication of someone doing something perfectly obvious. "I've taken Lila to 17 specialists," she said. "I've researched every program in the country. She stopped herself. The number wasn't relevant. A lot of time trying to make things easier for her." "I can tell," Ethan said. Something in his tone made her look at him. "That's not a criticism," he said. He was looking at Lila too. "It's obvious how much you love her." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "She has a way of making people feel like you haven't done enough." "Does she actually do that? Or is that you?" Vivian opened her mouth and closed it again. Ethan said, I'm not saying it like that. I just mean from the outside she seems fine. More than fine. She seems like a kid who's figured things out. She's figured out how to manage what she has," Vivian said carefully. "That's different from being okay." "Is it?" She didn't answer, because she wasn't sure she had an answer. She stared at the table for a moment, at the wood grain running in parallel lines under the varnish, and thought about that question. It was the kind of question she never asked herself, because asking it would require sitting with an answer that might not be comfortable. "What happened to her?" Ethan asked. Not intrusively. Just directly, the same way he'd been direct about everything else. "She was born with it. A degenerative condition limited light perception from birth. The specialists say there may be some possibility of treatment. Something newer. But she exhaled. It's uncertain. And expensive. And she'd have to go through a lot." "What does she say?" Vivian looked at him. "She's 8. She's also the person it's happening to," he said. Not argumentative. Just stating a fact he seemed to find obvious. Vivian didn't respond to that. She picked up her fork and moved some food around her plate and decided to change the subject. "What about you?" she said. "You mentioned a son, obviously. But you're doing this alone?" "Yeah." "His mother?" Pause was short but complete. "She died," he said. 4 years ago, aneurysm. She was 31. Vivian absorbed this. There was nothing to say to it that wasn't inadequate, so she just said, "I'm sorry." "Yeah." He said it the way people say it when the grief has become a permanent resident rather than a visitor, integrated, familiar, something they've learned to share a house with without being constantly surprised by it. "Noah was 6, Ethan said. He doesn't talk about it much. But he misses her. Do you?" He looked at her directly. "Every day. Less sharp now, but yeah," Vivian nodded. "Lila's father," she hesitated. "He's not around. We were never married. He's in London now, with a new family." She said it evenly, without inflection, the way she said most things that cost her something. He sees Lila twice a year, sometimes. Does that bother her? She says it doesn't. But Vivian looked at her daughter across the table. She told a school friend last year that she didn't have a dad. Not that her dad lived far away. Not that she didn't see him often. She just said she didn't have one. She paused. I don't know what to do with that. Ethan followed her gaze to Lila. Maybe nothing, he said. Maybe she just told the truth about how it feels. Vivian said nothing. Sometimes people don't need you to fix how they describe things, he said. Sometimes it's just honest. She looked at him. You sound like a therapist. I've had enough therapy to know when someone else needs some, he said. And there was something in the way he said it dry, self-aware, not precious about it, that made Vivian think she'd underestimated him in some way she couldn't quite name yet. They stayed until Felix started stacking chairs at other tables. Noah had fallen asleep in his chair somewhere between the dessert course and the end of the conversation, just quietly tipped sideways and gone under, in that total, uncomplicated way that children sleep when they're somewhere they feel safe. Lila had noticed the change in his breathing and said, in a whisper she didn't lower enough, he's asleep, as though reporting something remarkable. And Ethan had looked over and said, yeah, in a tone that meant this happens, and carefully repositioned his son so he wasn't going to tip off the chair. You should probably go, Vivian said. Probably. But he didn't move immediately. He was looking at the table with the same expression she'd noticed on him in the restaurant 2 weeks ago. The look of someone who is somewhere better than where they expected to be and isn't sure what to do about that. This was good, he said, like he was surprised. Yes, she said. Noah woke up when Ethan touched his shoulder, not startled, just a slow rise to the surface, eyes opening with the careful alertness of a kid who had learned to come out of sleep ready to understand the room. He looked around, established where he was, and looked at his father. Okay? Yeah. Time to go. Noah looked across the table at Lila, who was waiting, her face turned in the direction of his voice. See you, he said. See you, she said back, and then smiled at her own word choice, and Noah looked like he almost got the joke. Can I show you something tomorrow? Noah asked. Vivian started to say something about schedules, but Lila was already answering. What kind of something? There's a park near our apartment. There's a fountain, and it's loud. I thought maybe you'd like to hear it. Lila's face did that thing, the opening up, the reaching towards something. Yeah, she said, I'd like that. Noah looked at his father. Ethan looked at Vivian. Vivian thought about her Saturday morning. She had calls at 10 and a property review at noon, and she'd told her assistant she might be in the office by 2. We can do the park, she said. The park was 3 blocks from the building where Ethan and Noah lived, in a neighborhood that was several tax brackets below Vivian's usual geography. She noticed the distance between their lives the way she noticed most things quietly, without making anything of it, but it was there. The street his building was on had a laundromat on one corner and a tire shop on the other, and the cars, parked along the curb, were older and more dented than the ones in her neighborhood. And the sidewalk in front of his building had a crack in it that ran from the base of the steps all the way to the street. Ethan was waiting outside when their car pulled up. He had 2 cups of coffee. He held one out to Vivian as she got out of the car, and she took it before she thought to decline, and it turned out to be exactly the right strength. You didn't have to, she started. You drove across town at 9 in the morning on a Saturday, he said. Seemed like the least I could do. He had a thermos of hot chocolate for Lila, which he handed to her with a description of how hot it was and where the lid was and which direction to turn it to open. She handled it like she'd been given a small gift and held it against her chest as they walked. The park was small, more of a square, really a few old trees, a concrete path, some benches that had been repainted so many times the metal underneath had disappeared under layers of color. But the fountain in the center was a decent-sized thing, older than anything else in the park, and it made a sound that Vivian felt in her sternum. Lila stopped on the path about 10 feet away and just stood there. What does it look like? She asked Noah. Noah stood beside her and looked at the fountain seriously. It's round. The water goes up from the middle and then comes down in like curtains. Edges kind of fold when the wind hits them. He paused. The water in the basin is greenish from the bottom. There's a coin near the middle, and a pigeon is standing on the edge on the other side, but I think he's about to leave. As if on cue, the pigeon lifted and was gone. He left, Noah reported. I heard, Lila said. She took a step closer to the fountain, and another, until she was close enough that the mist was barely reaching her. She held out one hand and let the cool air touch her palm. Vivian stood a few feet back and watched her daughter stand in the spray of an old fountain in a park she'd never been to before, and felt something break open in her chest, not painfully, but undeniably. The way things break open when something you've been holding very tight finally, just barely, lets go. Ethan stepped up beside her. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the kids. She's not fragile, he said. Not a question. I know that, Vivian said a little sharply. I don't think you do, he said. Still not a question and not unkind. I think you know it here. He touched his temple briefly, but not the other place. Vivian looked at the side of his face. I don't mean it as an insult, he said. I spent 2 years after my wife died, after I left the SEALs, trying to make sure nothing could ever hurt Noah again. I arranged everything, controlled everything, cut everything down to what I could predict and manage. He paused. And he spent those 2 years being about half the kid he should have been. Vivian said nothing. Someone told me, Ethan continued, that I wasn't protecting him. I was just making the world smaller until it fit inside the fear. The fountain ran. A child somewhere else in the park was yelling at something. The wind moved through the old trees and made that specific sound, the dry, papery rattle of late autumn leaves holding on. Who told you that? Vivian asked. His teacher, 3rd grade. Called me in for a conference, and I thought it was about his grades. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She sat across from me in a tiny plastic chair and said, Mr. Carter, your son is capable of much more than you're letting him do. And I went home and thought about it for 3 weeks before I admitted she was right. Vivian watched Lila, who had moved to sit on the fountain's edge, Noah beside her, both of them trailing their fingers in the water, with the focused contentment of children who were exactly where they wanted to be. I just don't want anything to happen to her, Vivian said. Came out smaller than she intended. I know. He glanced at her. But right now nothing is. She's at a fountain with a friend. That's all that's happening. Vivian looked at her daughter. Lila was laughing at something. Noah had said a real, full-body laugh, her head tipping back, and the sound of it carried over the water noise and the wind and landed somewhere in Vivian's chest, like something dropped from a height. She realized, standing there, that she couldn't remember the last time she'd heard her daughter laugh like that, in a place she hadn't carefully arranged. October became November without any formal announcement. The dinners became a loose, irregular habit, sometimes Fridays, sometimes Saturdays, sometimes just Vivian texting Ethan that Lila was asking if Noah wanted to come over and study, which was a thin cover story for 2 children who had decided they were best friends and were working backward from that conclusion to find justifications. Ethan would text back one word, sure, or yeah, or sometimes just a thumbs up, and an hour later, Noah would show up with his backpack and his careful eyes, and spend 3 hours doing something that wasn't exactly studying, but somehow got both their homework done. Vivian's apartment made Noah visibly uncomfortable in a way he tried to hide and mostly didn't. He moved through the large, carefully designed rooms, like someone aware of the value of everything, which made him move carefully, which made him seem more solemn than he was. Lila noticed she noticed everything, and started walking him through the rooms when he arrived, narrating them the way he narrated things to her, naming what was where and what mattered and what was just decoration and could be ignored. This lamp is expensive. She'd say, passing something, but you can touch it because Mom's never actually liked it, and I think she'd be relieved if it broke. Noah would glance at the lamp. Is that true? Probably, Lila would say, entirely serious. Vivian overheard this once and didn't correct it, because it was, in fact, completely true. She and Ethan fell into the rhythm that happens when 2 cautious people are spending increasing amounts of time together and have both silently agreed not to name what's happening. They talked at the edges of the children's friendship over coffee, while Noah and Lila did homework, on the phone after the kids were in bed, in the parking lot of Domingo's after dinner, when neither of them wanted to be the one to end the evening, but neither of them was saying that out loud. They talked about practical things. Noah's school. Lila's upcoming appointment with the specialist. The building Vivian was developing on the east side of the city, and the permit problems that kept developing new dimensions. The motorcycle he was rebuilding in his garage, on Sundays an old Honda that someone had given up on, which he was returning to working condition one patient piece at a time. "Why motorcycles?" she asked one evening. "Grew up around them. My uncle had a shop." He shrugged. "There's something about taking something broken and making it run again. It's clear. Either it works or it doesn't. There's no gray area. Unlike everything else." Unlike everything else, he agreed. Vivian understood this. She'd built her career on the promise of clarity buildings, were either structurally sound or they weren't. Deals either made sense or they didn't. She'd always trusted numbers and assessments over feelings, because feelings had gray area and numbers mostly didn't. Ethan understood that logic, even if he'd arrived at it from a completely different direction. What she didn't tell him, not yet, not that evening, was that the specialist appointment she'd mentioned had contained information she was still processing. The doctor, a careful, measured woman named Hargreaves, who had been Lila's physician for 3 years, had sat across from her 2 weeks earlier and said that there was a new intervention being studied. It wasn't a cure, that it was uncertain and the process was lengthy and the outcome was unpredictable, but that in several cases it had produced meaningful improvement in light perception. That Lila, based on her specific presentation, was a reasonable candidate. Vivian had taken the literature and thanked the doctor and driven home and put the folder on her desk and then avoided looking at it for 11 days. She wanted to do it. She was ready to pay for the entire thing out of pocket, to get Lila into the program immediately, to make every phone call and negotiate every appointment and get this done. That was what she did. She identified problems and applied resources to them. That was what she'd been doing for 8 years. But she kept hearing Ethan's voice from the fountain. Person it's happening to. She kept thinking about the way Lila had described the fountain sound that morning, not as something to be experienced or overcome, but just as something beautiful, something she wanted to stand next to. She kept thinking about how Lila had never once, in 8 years, said she wished things were different. She'd asked questions and learned things and built her world, but she'd never said, "I wish I could see." Never. Not once that Vivian could recall. And she didn't know what to do with that. She brought it up to Ethan on a Thursday evening in mid-November, when the kids were both asleep, Lila in her room, Noah on Vivian's couch with his jacket pulled over him. Because the dinner had gone late, and he'd gone under again with his usual complete efficiency, and they were sitting at her kitchen table with the remains of coffee between them. She told him about the specialist's conversation, laid it out factually, the way she would have briefed a colleague. Procedure, the timeline, the uncertainty, the cost, the potential. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What does Lila say?" he asked. "I haven't told her yet." He looked at her. "I wanted to process it first," she said. "I wanted to understand it before you brought it to her." "Yes, so you could present it in a way that already had an answer embedded in it," he said. "Not accusatory. Just precise." Vivian opened her mouth and felt the objection form and dissolve. She looked at her coffee cup. "I don't do that," she said. "You do it at work. You told me about that development deal last week, the way you structured the vote, so the outcome was already built into how you framed the question. That's business. You manage the things you're afraid of," he said. "What you do. You get ahead of them. It's a good skill." But Lila isn't a deal to structure. Vivian was quiet. She hated that he was right. She hated it the way you hate being told something that you already knew and had been hiding from yourself. Because once someone else says it, the hiding is over. "What if she says no?" Vivian said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "What if I tell her and she says she doesn't want to do it? Then maybe she doesn't want to do it. This could help her." Could. He wasn't dismissing that, and that's worth telling her. All of it, what it is, what it might do, what the uncertainty is. Give her the real thing and let her have an opinion. "She's 8 years old. She's 8 years old," he agreed, and she walked across a restaurant full of strangers to sit with someone she'd never met, because something told her it was the right thing to do. He looked at Vivian steadily. She's got decent judgment. Vivian sat with that for a while. Kitchen was quiet. The city moved outside the window, 20 floors down, the distant sound of it, continuous and indifferent and somehow comforting. "What if I do everything right?" Vivian said, and she still ends up hurt. The question sat between them. Ethan looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "There's no version of love where that's not possible." Vivian didn't answer. "I know that's not what you want to hear," he said. "But the version where you control everything until nothing can hurt her that doesn't exist. And I think you already know that." She did know that. She'd known it for 8 years. She'd just spent 8 years building the most sophisticated possible system for not knowing it. "I'll talk to her," Vivian said finally, "about the treatment." "Okay. Not tomorrow, maybe this weekend. I need a minute." "Okay?" he said again. And he didn't push, and he didn't offer more advice, and he didn't tell her it was going to be fine. He just sat there, at her kitchen table at 11:30 at night, with his coffee going cold, being one of the only people in her life who managed to be honest with her without making her feel like she was being handled. She looked at him across the table. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. Why did you agree to this? To all of it?" "The dinners and the park and letting Noah come over." She paused. "Could have said no. When I called, you could have just not called back." "Most people would have." He thought about it for a moment. "Lila," he said. "What about her?" He was quiet for a moment, choosing words with the care of someone who doesn't use many of them. "When she walked across that restaurant when she sat down, I hadn't spoken to anyone who wasn't a coworker or Noah's teacher in probably 3 months." He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way you state a fact about weather. "Not really. Not like a person." He paused, and she just sat down and asked me what the windows looked like. Vivian looked at him. "She didn't need me to be anything," he said. "She just wanted to know what was outside." He picked up his coffee and looked at it. "I don't know. I hadn't felt like that in a long time. Like someone just wanted to talk to me because they wanted to talk to me. Not because of what I used to do or what I know or what I can fix." He set the cup down. "She just wanted to hear about the rain." Vivian said nothing for a moment. Then she said she does that to people. "Yeah." He almost smiled. I noticed. Vivian looked at her hands on the table. She thought about 8 years of building walls and managing outcomes and staying 3 steps ahead of everything that could go wrong. She thought about a little girl in a yellow dress walking across a room. She couldn't see toward a man she'd never met. She thought about how her daughter was braver than she was. "Thank you," she said, "for telling her what the windows looked like." Ethan looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "You could have just sent her back to me, but you described the rain." He was quiet for a moment. She asked. He said finally, "That's all." But they both knew it wasn't all. It was something specific, the willingness to just answer a child's question without making it about yourself or your discomfort or the situation's strangeness. To just describe the rain because someone wanted to know what it looked like. Vivian nodded once and picked up her coffee. Outside, the city went on. 20 floors below, a cab moved through an intersection, and its light swept briefly across the ceiling. Somewhere down the hallway, Noah slept in his jacket. And somewhere in the apartment, in the room at the end of the hall, Lila was breathing quietly in the dark, already knowing most of what the adults at the table were still figuring out. Vivian talked to Lila on a Sunday morning, the way she'd promised herself she would. She sat on the edge of Lila's bed, while her daughter was still in that half-awake place, hair loose. Face soft, the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 2 tucked under one arm, and she told her about the appointment with Dr. Hargreaves. Not a simplified version, not a managed version. She told her the real thing, the way Ethan had said to, with all the uncertainty included. She explained what the treatment was, how it worked, what it might do, what it might not do. Lila listened the whole time without moving. When Vivian finished, there was a silence in the room, the particular Sunday morning silence of the city, muffled and slow, nothing urgent happening anywhere. Then Lila said, "Is it going to hurt?" "Some parts will be uncomfortable," Vivian said. "Probably not painful, but tiring." Lila nodded slowly. Her hand moved without thought, finding the rabbit's ear, rubbing it between her fingers, the way she'd been doing since she was a toddler. "And it might not work?" "It might not work. But it might. It might." Another silence. "Can I think about it?" Lisa said. Vivian had prepared herself for tears. She'd prepared herself for fear, for confusion, for the particular heartbreak of watching her daughter absorb something complicated and hard. She had not prepared herself for "can I think about it," said, with the measured calmness of someone who needed time to make a real decision. course, Vivian said. I want to ask Noah what he thinks. Vivian blinked. Noah? He's good at thinking about things. Lila pulled the rabbit closer. He doesn't tell me what to feel. Vivian sat there for a moment. She was aware of something, some territory shift she couldn't entirely map, but she said, okay, and left her daughter to it. Called Ethan from the hallway, standing outside Lila's closed door, and told him what had happened. She wants to think about it, she said, and she wants to talk to Noah. There was a pause on the other end. How do you feel about that? Honestly, she leaned against the wall, like I've been replaced. By a 9-year-old, he said, by a very sensible 9-year-old. She heard something that might have been him almost laughing. That's a good sign, he said. I know it is. She looked at the door. I know. Noah came over that afternoon, which was not unusual by November. He arrived on his own. Ethan had taught him the bus route 3 months earlier, a fact that still made Vivian quietly nervous and that she had never said out loud because she understood that it wasn't her business. And he took off his shoes at the door the way he always did, which was a habit he'd developed entirely on his own. After the first time, Lila had tracked a muddy footprint from the hallway to her room, and he'd watched how she'd had to remap that section of the floor. Vivian gave them the kitchen. She sat in her office and looked at reports she wasn't reading, and listened to the low murmur of 2 children having a conversation she had no part of. She couldn't hear the words. She wasn't trying to. She just listened to the rhythm of it, the back and forth, the silences, the sound of Lila's laugh once and Noah's more muted response, and then a longer quiet, and then more talking. After 40 minutes, Lila knocked on the office door. I want to do it, she said. Vivian looked up. Lila was standing in the doorway with her usual straight posture, her face turned accurately toward her mother's desk. She'd learned the room well enough that she almost always got it right. Okay, Vivian said, but I want to understand everything first. Before we start, I want Dr. Hargreaves to explain it to me, not just to you. Of course, and I want Noah to know what's happening. During, not after. Vivian thought about this. I can ask Ethan. I already asked Noah, Lila said. He said, yeah. Vivian put down her pen. You two covered a lot of ground in 40 minutes. Noah's efficient, Lila said, and went back to the kitchen. Vivian sat in her office for another moment. Then she picked up her phone and texted Ethan. She said yes. Also, your son apparently now co-manages our medical decisions. His response came back in under a minute. He gets that from me. Then, a few seconds later, that's good, Vivian. Really good. She read it twice and put her phone down and went to find her daughter. December arrived with the particular impatience of a month that always had too much in it. Preliminary appointments with Dr. Hargreaves' team began 3 sessions of testing and assessment, each one in a different part of the medical center, each one asking Lila to do things with her limited vision that she found alternately interesting and tedious. She was cooperative throughout, which surprised the technicians and didn't surprise Vivian at all. Lila had always been cooperative with things she'd agreed to. It was the things she hadn't agreed to that she handled with quiet, immovable resistance. Noah got a full debrief after each appointment. Lila called him from the car on the way home, and Vivian drove and listened to her daughter explain the day's procedures in precise detail. And Noah asked questions that were sometimes surprisingly technical and sometimes so basic they looped back around to being important. Does it hurt? No. Were the doctors nice? Most of them. Are you scared? A little. Me too. That last one surprised Vivian enough that she glanced in the rearview mirror, but Lila had already moved on, describing the particular smell of the examination room, which she thought was like rubber, and something sweet, which she suspected was hand sanitizer. Ethan drove Vivian to one of the later appointments. She hadn't asked him to, she'd mentioned the date in passing, and he'd said he could take the morning off, and she'd said she didn't want to put him out, and he'd said it wasn't a problem, and the conversation had ended there, which turned out to mean he was picking them up at 8:30. He sat in the waiting room while Lila was in with the team, which was mostly empty at that hour, just a man asleep in a corner chair and a woman at the other end of the row, reading something on her phone. Vivian sat beside Ethan, and neither of them spoke for a while. The room had the particular quality of medical waiting rooms. Everywhere, the flat lighting, the magazines no one read, the low-grade hum of a building working hard to stay at the right temperature. I keep thinking about what she said. Vivian said eventually. When I told her, and she asked if she could think about it. What about it? She was so calm. Vivian looked at her hands. I spent 2 weeks dreading that conversation. I ran through every possible version of it in my head. What if she cried? What if she was angry? What if she said no? What if she said yes and was terrified? She paused. And she just asked if she could think about it. Surprised you. She always surprises me. There was something in her voice that wasn't complaint. She has since she was 3. I make plans for who she's going to be, and she's always something slightly different. Something better. Ethan looked sideways at her. You say that like it's a problem. It's not a problem, she exhaled. It just means I spend a lot of time making the wrong plans. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said Noah surprised me like that last year. I'd been telling him since his mother died, I'd been telling him that it was okay to be sad. That he could talk to me, that nothing was off the table. He paused. And he never did, never once. I thought he was holding it in. I thought I was failing at this thing that mattered more than anything. He looked at the wall across from them. Then his teacher sent home a journal he'd written for class. About someone he admired. He wrote about his mother. 5 pages. About specific things, the way she made coffee, the songs she sang wrong on purpose to make him laugh. Real specific things. He stopped. Vivian waited. He wasn't holding it in, Ethan said. He was just carrying it differently than I expected. It wasn't going to come out the way I was watching for. He glanced at her. Kids know how to take care of what's theirs. Sometimes we spend so much time providing the container that we miss what they've already built. Vivian absorbed this. I still worry, she said. I'm not going to suddenly stop worrying. I know. He almost smiled. Me neither. But I've started, she thought about how to say it, asking first. Instead of just doing. She looked at the door to the examination area. Small thing. But I've started asking. That's not a small thing, he said. The holidays came. This was the part of the year Ethan navigated by momentum. He didn't think too far ahead. He focused on the specific thing in front of him, which in December meant Noah's school Christmas program and the motorcycle that was almost finished and the overtime shifts at the shop that helped cover January. He'd gotten good at the logistics of a holiday without a second adult. He'd gotten good at a lot of things he'd never wanted to learn. Noah's program was on the 14th. Ethan sat in a third-row gymnasium chair that was built for someone smaller and watched his son stand at the back of a group of 4th graders and sing with the focused sincerity of a boy who understood that this mattered to someone, even if it wasn't entirely clear that it mattered to himself. Vivian and Lila were there. This had been arranged by Noah, who had informed his father approximately 1 week in advance that he'd invited Lila to his school program, and she was coming, and had delivered this information with the tone of someone reporting a logistical update rather than asking permission. Ethan had called Vivian. Did you know about this? I found out yesterday, she'd said. Lila mentioned it was important she be there. How did she know it was important? Noah told her. A pause. Apparently he told her the year before he didn't have anyone cheering for him except you, and you don't cheer, you just watch. Ethan had sat with that for a moment. That's not I watch. That's how I show I'm paying attention. I know, Vivian had said, and hadn't added anything else, which Ethan suspected was generous of her. They sat together in the gymnasium, Vivian, Lila, Ethan, in a row of those 2 small chairs, and when Noah came out with his class, Lila clapped before anyone else, loudly, because Noah had told her exactly where he'd be standing so she could aim at the right part of the stage. And Noah caught the direction of the stage, and Noah caught the direction of the sound, and his face did something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. Afterward, in the parking lot, Noah stood beside his father and said to Lila, I saw you clapping. Good, Lila said. I wanted you to see, Noah nodded. Something passed between them, one of those exchanges that was really about something underneath the words, something they'd apparently worked out in the 40-minute kitchen conversation in November and didn't need to discuss again. Ethan stood in the cold parking lot and watched the 2 kids walk ahead toward the car, Noah describing the small amount of snow that had appeared on the gymnasium's flat roof, Lila asking if it was enough to touch, Noah saying probably not, but she could try if she wanted. The ease between them had continued to develop over the past 2 months, not the giddy ease of a new friendship, which burns bright and sometimes burns out, but something more durable. They disagreed sometimes, argued about things what a color looked like, whether a sound was low or high, once a heated debate about whether quiet could be a smell. They came to conclusions that were neither person's original position and kept going. Vivian walked beside Ethan, her coat pulled against the cold. "Thank you for coming," he said. She looked at him. "Noah wanted us here. I know. I'm thanking you anyway." She looked at the kids walking ahead. "He sang in the third row, back left," she said. He was the only one actually moving his mouth for the second verse. Ethan glanced at her. "You were watching that carefully?" "I was watching the faces," she said. "Habit. You can tell a lot from whether people are actually doing the thing or performing doing the thing." And Noah was actually doing it. Noah was actually doing it. She paused. "For Lila." Ethan looked at his son, who was holding out his hand so Lila could judge the distance to the car by the sunfied steps. "Yeah," he said, "I think so." It was Marcus, the friend who hadn't shown up to Harlow's, who brought the news. He called on the second Saturday of January early, before Ethan had finished his first cup of coffee. Noah was still asleep. Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing the gray, unconvinced thing it did in January, when winter had been going on long enough to lose the novelty and hadn't found the discipline to be truly cold. Marcus didn't waste time. He never did. Voss reached out. Ethan set his coffee cup down. Voss was James Voss, who had been the commanding officer of Ethan's SEAL team for the last 3 years before Ethan left the service, who had pulled him through things that had no names in civilian life, who had a voice like gravel in a cement mixer and the judgment of someone who had learned that fast decisions and correct decisions were not always the same category. "What does he want?" Ethan said. "He's putting a team together. Private security, technically. But the mission." Marcus paused. "It's real. It's operational. The target is a trafficking network running out of 3 countries. These guys have been." He stopped. "It's bad, Ethan. What they're doing. And the people who can do anything about it are running out of options." Ethan stood at his kitchen window and looked at the gray city. "Why me?" "Because you're the best close quarters tactician Voss ever worked with," Marcus said. "And because you got out clean. No political debt, no complications. He needs clean. I have a son. He knows that. It's 3 months. In and out. He's done longer ops with guys who had families. Those guys made choices I don't want to repeat. Ethan." Marcus's voice shifted, lost the operational tone, became the voice of someone who'd known him for 15 years. "I know what you gave up when you got out. I was there. I know what coming back could mean for you. I'm not sure it means what it used to." A silence. "Think about it," Marcus said. "Talk to Voss. Just talk." Ethan said he would think about it and ended the call. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. His coffee went cold. Outside, a pigeon landed on the fire escape and looked at him through the window with the profound indifference of something that had already decided how it felt about January. He thought about the missions he'd been on in 12 years of service. He thought about the particular feeling of having a purpose that was clear and measurable. Either you accomplished it or you didn't. Either people came home or they didn't. And there was a brutal simplicity in that. He'd spent 3 years in civilian life discovering that almost nothing else worked that way. He thought about what Marcus had said about the network, what they were doing, the kind of harm that would keep happening if the people who could stop it didn't. And then he thought about Noah, asleep at the end of the hall. He thought about a phone call 3 months ago. After a dinner at Vivian's apartment that had run late, Noah asleep on the couch again, Vivian walking him to the door while the city did its thing below the windows. She'd said something on the doorstep, not a big thing, just a small, offhand thing. "I'm glad you're here," meaning the evening, meaning the dinner, meaning all of it in the casual, understated way she said important things. He stood at the kitchen window for a long time. Then he went to wake Noah up and make breakfast and not say anything about it for a few days, because he needed to be in the same room as his normal life before he could make a decision about whether to leave it. He told Vivian on a Wednesday. He hadn't planned to tell her on a Wednesday. He hadn't planned to tell her at all, yet he was still in the processing phase, still turning the thing over, still trying to identify what it was he actually wanted versus what he was trained to want. But they were in her kitchen. Lila at school, Noah at school, And Vivian had asked him something about his week, with the specific attentiveness she had when she knew something was off, and he'd told her. He laid it out the way he laid most things out factually, without preamble. The call from Marcus Voss, the mission, the 3 months, the what it was for. Vivian listened across the kitchen counter, her coffee in both hands, her face doing the thing it did when she was processing something she didn't like but wasn't going to manage out loud. When he finished, there was a silence. "What are you thinking?" she asked. The voice was careful, neutral in the specific way that meant the opposite. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "Is that true?" He looked at her. "Because you have the same look you have when you've already made a decision, and you're working out how to feel about it," she said. He sat with that for a moment. "I don't know," he said again. And this time he meant it differently. Not "I haven't decided, but I know what I'd do before, and I'm not sure it's the person deciding now." Vivian set her coffee down. "Can I say something?" "Yeah. I'm not going to tell you not to go." She said it carefully, evenly. It's not my place. You have your own life and your own sense of what matters, and I'm not going to pretend I have any right to that decision. "But," he said, because he could hear the shape of the sentence, "but I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before you answer." She looked at him. "Is this who you are now, or is this who you were?" He didn't answer immediately. Because the man who sat at a corner table at Harlow's in October, she said, was very good at being alone. He'd gotten efficient at it. He knew how to need nothing from the room he was in. She wasn't saying it with judgment. She was saying it like someone reading a situation she'd observed carefully. "And I don't think he's fully that person anymore. And I'm asking whether what you're feeling right now is a callback to something real or a callback to a version of yourself that was." She paused easier. "Because it only needed one thing from you." Ethan looked at the counter. "The mission is real," he said. "What they're doing is real. I believe you. People who can do something about it are rare." "I believe that too." She didn't waver. "I'm not arguing about the mission. I'm asking about you." He was quiet for a long time. Kitchen had a specific quality at this hour, the mid-morning quiet of a day that had started and settled. The city outside doing its ordinary business, the refrigerator making its small mechanical sound. He'd sat in this kitchen a dozen times over the past few months, and it had started to feel the way places feel when you've been in them enough familiar in the bone, known in the peripheral sense. "I've been thinking about Noah," he said finally. "I know. I keep thinking I went through my whole career telling myself I was doing it for something larger than myself, that it was worth the risk because the outcome mattered." He looked up. And that was true. It was true. But at some point I had to ask who was taking the risk, and the answer was Noah. He was the one who would have had no father. He paused. And I'd made that decision for him. Vivian was quiet. "I'm not saying the answer is no," he said. "I'm saying I don't know yet." "That's fair," she said. "I need to talk to Voss. Actually talk to him, not just Marcus's version." "Okay?" He looked at her. "Are you angry?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered things. "No," she said. She stopped, looked at her coffee, looked back at him. "I'm not going to lie to you. The idea of you leaving," she stopped again, pressed her lips together. "I'm not angry, I'm scared. And I'm aware that being scared about it means something I haven't fully admitted to myself yet." He held her gaze. "Don't make the decision based on that," she said. "I mean it. Don't. I know. I've made enough decisions based on fear to know it's a terrible compass." "I know," he said again. She picked up her coffee and looked at it. "Talk to Voss," she said. "And then whatever you decide, tell me the truth. Don't manage the conversation. Just tell me." "Yeah," he said. "I will." He left an hour later. On the elevator going down, he stood and watched the floor numbers descend and thought about what she'd said. Is this who you are now, or who you were? He didn't have a clean answer. The honest answer was that he wasn't entirely sure the two versions were separate anymore, that after 12 years of being one thing, the thing didn't just switch off because you came home and got a job at a garage and learned to make your kids lunch every morning. The elevator opened. He walked through the lobby and out into the January cold. Called Voss the following Monday. Voss was in the same city, which Ethan hadn't known. He'd assumed overseas somewhere. Voss was always overseas somewhere. Or had been in the years Ethan knew him. But he was 40 minutes away, in a part of the city that had more warehouses than residences. and he agreed to meet without any of the technical language Ethan had expected. They met at a diner. Voss was already there when Ethan arrived, sitting in a booth near the back, looking like he'd been there for an hour, which meant he'd probably arrived 2 hours ago. He was a big man with close-cut gray hair and hands that had been broken in too many places to look anything other than weathered. He was 61. He looked 61 in the specific way of someone who had spent those years at full capacity. "Carter," he said. Commander Ethan said, retired. "Old habit." Voss waved at the seat across from him. Ethan sat. A waitress appeared. They both ordered coffee. Voss waited until the coffee came before he said anything real. That was a habit, Ethan remembered. Never start the actual conversation until everyone's hands have something to do. "How are you?" Voss said. "Good," Ethan said. "Really?" Ethan looked at him. "Different than I expected. But yeah." "Good." Voss studied him. "You look—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Settled," he said. "You look settled. Is that a problem?" "No." Voss said it without hesitation. "It's not a problem." There was a silence, not uncomfortable, the kind that settles between people who've sat through much longer silences together, in worse conditions. "Tell me about the mission," Ethan said. Voss did. He laid it out with the clear, unornamental precision that Ethan had always respected in him. No inflation, no recruiting language. The network, the scale, the 3 countries, the specific gap that Ethan could fill. Timeline. The risks, real and actual. He didn't tell Ethan it was manageable when it wasn't. He never did. When he finished, Ethan looked at his coffee cup. "How many on the team?" he said. 7. You'd be 8. "Who?" Voss named them. Ethan knew 4 of them well, 2 by reputation, 1 not at all. "The unknown is the unknown," Voss said. "Hernandez. She's good. Not your background, but different kind of good." Ethan nodded. He asked 4 more questions, specific ones, the kind that anyone who didn't know what they were asking wouldn't know to ask. Voss answered all of them directly. Then Ethan sat back and looked at the window. The diner was on a street that had a bus stop across from it, and a bus had pulled in, and people were getting off. A woman with 2 bags, a man in a work jacket, a kid with a backpack who jumped the last step and landed with a small unnecessary flourish that made Ethan think of Noah in a way he couldn't exactly explain. "I have a son," Ethan said. "I know. He's 9. He's had one parent for 4 years. "I know," Voss said again. He wasn't dismissing it. He was just knowing it, along with the rest. "I also have—" Ethan stopped. Voss waited. "People," Ethan said, which was inadequate, and also somehow exactly right. Voss looked at him for a moment, the gray eyes that had always missed nothing. "That's new," he said. "Yeah. Good new or complicated new?" Ethan thought about Vivian at her kitchen counter saying, "I'm scared, and I'm aware that being scared about it means something I haven't fully admitted to myself yet." He thought about the way she said important things in the flattest possible voice, as if she could neutralize the weight of them by refusing to perform it. He thought about Lila at the fountain with her hand in the mist. He thought about Noah jumping the last step off the school bus because 9 was still young enough to jump the last step. "Both," he said. Voss nodded once. "I'll tell you what I told Marcus," Voss said. "I need an answer in 2 weeks, but I need the right answer, not the fast one." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "I've had enough people on my teams who were there for the wrong reasons. Someone who's half somewhere else is a liability." He met Ethan's eyes. "If you're not in all the way, tell me now. I'd rather build with 6 I can count on." "I understand," Ethan said. "I know you do." Voss took a drink of his coffee. "What I'm telling you is I mean it. Don't come because you think you should. Don't come because it's what you know. Don't come because it's easier than whatever complicated thing you've got going at home." Ethan looked at him. "Come because you want to," Voss said. "Or don't come." The bus across the street had left. The stop was empty again. A pigeon landed where it had been and looked around with the optimistic displeasure of an animal that had arrived too late for whatever was supposed to be there. Ethan drove home and made dinner and helped Noah with a worksheet about the water cycle and listened to his son explain, incorrectly but with great confidence, how evaporation worked. He corrected him gently. Noah accepted the correction without much resistance because he was interested in being right more than in being right first. After Noah went to bed, Ethan sat in the kitchen. He wasn't deciding. He was just sitting there, In the kitchen of the apartment he'd moved into 3 years ago when the rent was right and the school district was decent, and he hadn't thought much beyond those two variables. The apartment that had a crack in the hallway where he'd accidentally put his fist through the drywall on the worst night of the first year after Sarah died, that he'd patched badly and then repainted the wrong shade of white. That had a drawer in the kitchen that didn't fully close because the hinge was off and he'd bought the right screw 6 months ago, and it was still sitting on the counter. He'd been meaning to fix that drawer for 6 months. He got up, found the screwdriver, sat on the kitchen floor and fixed the drawer. It took 11 minutes. When he was done, he put the screwdriver away and stood and looked at the drawer, which now opened and closed correctly, and thought about how many small things he'd been meaning to get to. The step on the outside of Vivian's building, he'd noticed it was cracking last month when he was waiting for her. Lila's music stand, which had a wobbly leg she'd mentioned twice. The latch on the gate at the park near Noah's school, which the kids had to lift and shake to get open. Small things. Things that needed someone to notice them and stay long enough to fix them. He stood in his kitchen at 11 at night and understood that he'd been making a decision for longer than he'd admitted. Picked up his phone. Not to call Voss. Not yet. He texted Vivian, "You awake?" 3 minutes later, yes. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he wrote back. Then he deleted it. He looked at the phone for a moment. "I talked to Voss today," he typed. "I think I know what I want to do. Can I tell you in person?" The response came quickly, which meant she'd been holding the phone. "Tomorrow," she wrote. "Come for breakfast." He put his phone down. He turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dark, in the apartment he'd been living in for 3 years, in the city that had a fountain in a park 3 blocks from here, where a blind girl had held out her hand and let the cold mist touch her palm and looked like someone who had found exactly what she needed. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in weeks. He arrived at 8:15. Vivian buzzed him up without asking who it was, which meant she'd been listening for the intercom, which meant she hadn't slept, as well as she'd probably told herself she would. He took the elevator up, and she opened the door before he knocked. And she was in the clothes she wore when she wasn't performing anything: jeans, a plain gray sweater, hair pulled back without precision. She'd made coffee. The apartment smelled like it. "Lila's at school," she said, stepping back to let him in. "Noah?" "Same." He came in and hung his jacket on the hook by the door. He'd started doing that automatically somewhere around November, and neither of them had remarked on it. They went to the kitchen. She poured him coffee without asking how he took it, because she'd been paying attention for 3 months. He sat at the counter and wrapped his hands around the mug and looked at it for a moment. "I'm not going," he said. Vivian had her back to him, putting the coffee pot back. She was still for a moment. Then she turned around and looked at him with the expression she had when she was deciding whether to believe something. "That's not," she started. "It's not because of you," he said. "Or not only." He looked up. "I want to be clear about that. I didn't make this decision because you were scared, or because I was trying to manage your feelings." She came and sat on the other side of the counter. "Then why?" she said. He told her about the kitchen floor. The 11 minutes. He told her about standing afterward and thinking about the cracked step outside her building and Lila's wobbly music stand and the gate at the park. He told her that it had sounded meaningless even in his own head when he was trying to articulate it, but that it had been the most honest version of the answer he had. Vivian listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about her he'd come to rely on without realizing it. "Voss asked me not to come for the wrong reasons," he said. "I think going would have been the wrong reason." "What was the reason?" He thought about how to say it. "It was clear," he said finally. "That's all. The mission, the objective, the team, all of it was clear. I know how to do that. I've done it for 12 years. He looked at his coffee. "And everything here is the opposite of clear. Complicated." "Yeah, but," he stopped. "The complicated thing is the actual thing. The other one just felt like the actual thing." Vivian looked at him for a moment. He expected something, some response that resolved the weight of it, some acknowledgement that made the shape of the moment official. She said, "Okay, that's it?" "I think that's it," she said. "Unless you need something else from me." He looked at her. "No." "Then okay." She picked up her coffee. "You want eggs?" He stared at her. "I'm going to make eggs," she said. You can help or you can sit there. Either is fine. He sat there for about 30 seconds, and then he got up and helped. Called Voss that afternoon and told him. Voss was quiet for a moment on the other end. Not surprised, Ethan didn't think Voss was often surprised, but processing. You sure? He said. Yeah, you've got good instincts, Voss said. Always did. A pause. What you've got going there, whatever it is, don't screw it up. Working on it. Good man. And Voss hung up, which was how Voss always ended conversations. Without ceremony, because he'd always believed that the important part of a conversation happened in the middle, and the ending was just logistics. Ethan put his phone in his pocket and went back to work. The shop was busy in January, people waiting until after the holidays to deal with things that had been wrong since September, the specific automotive procrastination of people who'd had other priorities. He spent the afternoon on a transmission that needed more patience than he had and gave it the patience anyway, because that was the job. Marcus called at 4. Voss told me, he said. I figured he would. You okay? Yeah. A pause. Ethan. Marcus's voice had dropped into the register it used for things that weren't logistical. For what it's worth, I think you made the right call. Ethan was quiet for a moment. How would you know? Because the last time I talked to you before October, you sounded like someone killing time, Marcus said. You don't sound like that anymore. Ethan didn't have a response to that. He thanked Marcus and ended the call and stood in the bay of the garage with grease on his forearm and the January cold coming in under the door and felt not relieved exactly, not settled. Something more like the feeling after you set something heavy down. The acknowledgement of weight you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped feeling it as weight. Lila's treatment began in the 3rd week of January. The first phase was the least invasive medication and monitoring, weekly appointments, a lot of waiting. Dr. Hargreaves was careful with Lila, which Lila appreciated. The doctor spoke to her directly and answered her questions without the slightly patronizing simplification that some medical professionals defaulted to with children. Lila noticed this immediately and relaxed in a way she didn't always relax in clinical settings. Vivian sat in every waiting room. She'd cleared her schedule on appointment days with a ruthlessness that had made her assistant blink, because Vivian's schedule was the kind of thing that resisted clearing, that had a way of filling itself back in if you weren't vigilant. But she was vigilant about this in a way she hadn't been about her own calendar in years, maybe ever. Ethan drove them on the days when the appointments ran into the afternoon. Because his boss at the shop, a man named Gerald, who was 64, and had known enough hard knocks himself to recognize when someone needed flexibility, had told him to take the time he needed and make it up on Saturdays. And Ethan had said he would, and then actually done it every week. Noah came to 2 of the appointments. He sat in the waiting room with Vivian and did homework or something that involved a notebook and a lot of crossing things out, and when Lila came out from the examination area, he always said the same thing, how was it? Not how do you feel or was it okay, or any of the other questions that required Lila to assess and report her emotional state. Just how was it? The same way you'd ask someone about their day. Lila always told him, in detail. While they were waiting for the elevator, she'd give him a complete debrief and he'd listen and ask specific follow-up questions that showed he'd retained the previous ones. And by the time they reached the lobby, she'd be talking about something else entirely, a sound she'd heard in the examination hallway, or something she'd thought about during the waiting, or an argument she was constructing about why her school's approach to geography was fundamentally misconceived. Vivian watched this from slightly behind and tried to learn from it. She was trying. This was the part of herself she was least patient with, the trying. She'd spent her entire adult life being good at things, which meant she had very little practice at the intermediate stage of anything, the stage where you understand enough to know how far you have to go. But she kept showing up to the intermediate stage, because Ethan had said back in her kitchen in November, at 11 at night over cold coffee, that she was making the world smaller until it fit inside the fear, and she'd been carrying that sentence around ever since, like a stone in her pocket that she needed to keep touching to remember was there. She stopped finishing Lila's sentences. She stopped reaching for Lila's hand in public before Lila reached for hers. She started letting Lila navigate the medical center hallways herself, slowly, with Vivian a few feet back, Her own hands clasped together to keep them from moving, and she watched her daughter count doorways and track echoes and find the right room on her own. And the pride of it was almost indistinguishable from the fear of it, which she was beginning to understand was how it was always going to be. February brought something nobody had expected. Started small. Lila mentioned it on a Thursday evening, casually, in the middle of dinner, in the tone she used for things she wasn't sure were worth noting. "The lamp," she said, meaning the floor lamp in the corner of the living room that Vivian had been meaning to replace for 2 years. "It looks different." Vivian looked up from her plate. "Different how?" "Brighter. More there." Lila frowned slightly, like it's insisting. Vivian set down her fork. "Has it always done that?" Lila asked. "It's the same lamp," Vivian said carefully. Lila considered this. She turned her head toward it, the slight, accurate angle she always used. She said, and went back to dinner. Vivian called Dr. Hargreaves the next morning. The doctor was measured, as she always was, careful not to attribute too much to one observation, careful not to dismiss it either. She adjusted the monitoring schedule. She asked Vivian to keep notes. She said they would see. Vivian kept notes. She kept them in a small notebook she bought specifically for the purpose, and she wrote down everything Lila said about light and shadow and the behavior of familiar objects, with dates and times, the way she would have documented a due diligence process. Good at documentation. It gave the fear somewhere to go. Over the next 3 weeks, there were more moments. Lila noticed when the kitchen light was off in the morning, before Vivian mentioned it. She tracked the movement of sunlight across the living room floor without being told the direction of the windows. She recognized the shape of her bedroom doorway from a distance that she couldn't have managed before, not seeing it exactly, but perceiving the change in light density, the way a room with an open door breathes differently than a room with one closed. She didn't make much of it. She mentioned these things, the way she mentioned other sensory details, the smell of rain through a window, the specific acoustics of the medical center hallway as observations. Interesting, worth noting. She didn't treat them as events. This restraint, Vivian was beginning to understand, was not denial. It was protection. Lila had learned, in 8 years of a world that wanted to make her vision the defining thing about her, to hold new information lightly until she was sure it meant what it seemed to mean. She didn't celebrate prematurely. She didn't mourn prematurely. She waited for the actual evidence. Vivian was trying to learn this skill and finding it was the hardest thing she'd attempted in recent memory. She told Ethan on a Saturday morning while the kids were at the park. They were in her kitchen again. They were always in her kitchen, which had become the room where the real conversations happened, maybe because it was the room where your hands could be doing something else while your mouth said difficult things. She told him about the lamp, about the doorway, about the pattern of small moments that doctor. Hargreaves was now tracking with careful attention. Ethan listened. "Is she excited?" he asked. "She's." Vivian thought about it. "She's interested, like it's a new thing to pay attention to." "She's not," she paused. "She's not reacting the way I expected." "What did you expect?" "More." She looked at her hands. I thought it would feel like more." To her, Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Maybe it does," he said. "And she's keeping it somewhere you can't see." Vivian looked up. "Or maybe," he said, "she's just taking it the way she takes everything. Straight, on its own terms." He looked at the window. "She doesn't need it to mean something. It can just be what it is." "A change," Vivian said. "Yeah, not a miracle, just a change." Vivian nodded slowly. She was thinking about the night she'd sat on Lila's bed and told her about the treatment, and Lila had asked, "Can I think about it with the calm of someone who already understood that her life was hers to decide about?" She was thinking about what it meant to have raised that child not intentionally, not by design, because God knew her instincts had been running in the opposite direction for most of Lila's life. But somehow, despite all the walls she'd built and the variables she'd tried to control, she'd raised a child who knew how to be in her own life without flinching. "I think I want to tell her what the doctors are seeing," Vivian said. "Not manage it, not frame it, just tell her." "Yeah," Ethan said. "Do that," she told Lila that afternoon. They sat on the couch together, Lila's feet tucked under her, the stuffed rabbit nearby but not in hand, the posture of a child who is ready to listen, and Vivian gave her the real thing. The numbers from Dr. Hargreaves, the change in the monitoring, what it might mean and what it might not mean, and how uncertain all of it still was. Lila listened. When Vivian finished, Lila was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." Vivian blinked. "You know what? Something's different." She tilted her head in that listening way. "I've been noticing for a few weeks. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure it was real and not just—" She paused, "not just wanting." Vivian looked at her daughter. "I didn't want it too much," Lila said quietly, "in case it stopped." The simplicity of that, the 8-year-old logic of it, the ancient human wisdom of it hit Vivian somewhere behind the sternum. She reached over and put her hand over Lila's, and for once she just left it there without purpose. Not guiding, not protecting. Just there. Lysel turned her hand over and held on. "Mom," she said. "Yeah, it's okay if it stops." Vivian didn't answer right away. "I mean it," Lila said. "I'm okay. I've always been okay." "I know," Vivian said, and for the first time in 8 years, she almost believed it in the place that mattered. March arrived, and the treatment moved into its second phase. This was the harder part, not painful, as Dr. Hargreaves had said, but demanding more frequent appointments, more precise monitoring, a set of exercises Lila did each morning that required concentration and patience, and a tolerance for incremental, almost imperceptible progress. Some days the changes were noticeable. Some days they weren't. Some days Lila came home from school quieter than usual, and Vivian didn't press, and Lila eventually said what was on her mind in her own time, which was always the right time. The 4 of them had developed a rhythm by this point, not a formal arrangement, not a scheduled thing, just the particular shape that forms when people have started expecting each other. Wednesday evenings, usually at Vivian's, because the kitchen was bigger, and Ethan had figured out where everything was and stopped apologizing for knowing. Saturday mornings? Sometimes the park, sometimes not, depending on the weather and what the kids had decided. The occasional evening that started as dinner and became something longer, the hours moving without anyone noticing, until someone looked at the time and said something that everyone half ignored for another 40 minutes. Noah had become Lila's primary narrator. This had happened gradually and then completely, the way most things between them happened. He described things she asked about and things she didn't ask about, unprompted observations, his running commentary on the world around them, delivered with the matter-of-fact regularity of breathing. He'd developed a vocabulary for it, a specific precision. He didn't just say it's blue. He said it's the blue that looks almost gray in this light, like the sky just before it decides what kind of day it's going to be. He didn't know he was doing anything unusual. This was just how he talked to Lila, and he'd been doing it long enough that it had become the way he processed things himself by finding the words for exactly what was there. Lila, in turn, had taught him things that surprised him. She'd taught him to listen to rooms, to identify the difference between a space that was crowded and a space that was large by the way sound moved in it. She'd taught him to navigate unfamiliar places by counting, by feeling changes in air, by trusting his feet more than his eyes. She'd taught him, obliquely and without curriculum, that the information you thought you needed was often less important than the information you were already receiving without knowing it. He was a different kid than he'd been in September. Not unrecognizably different, he was still the careful, observant, slightly too serious boy he'd always been. But something had loosened in him. He laughed more. He jumped the last step off the school bus more. He asked more questions in class, which his teacher had noted in her most recent email to Ethan, with an enthusiasm that suggested it had been a while coming. Ethan noticed all of this. He sat in Vivian's kitchen on a Wednesday evening in March and watched his son explain something about the park fountain to Lila, the way the water volume had changed since they'd been there in November, lower now. A different sound, and he thought about who Noah had been 3 years ago, in the first year after Sarah. Quiet in the particular way of a child who had learned that the adults around him were fragile and needed handling. Careful about his own feelings in a way that no 6-year-old should have to be. He thought about the kid across the kitchen, currently using his fork to demonstrate the angle of the water arc, entirely unconcerned about whether any adult in the room needed handling. Vivian came and sat beside him. She'd been on the phone something about a property on the east side that had developed a complication, which was how Vivian's work seemed to operate. Complication, accreting on complication until she solved the underlying thing. She sat down with the expression she had after a difficult call, which was mostly controlled, slightly frayed at the edges. "Everything okay?" Ethan said. "Contractor issue. I'll deal with it tomorrow." She looked at the kids. "They've been talking about that fountain for 15 minutes. They talk about it a lot. I know." She watched them for a moment. It was the first place he showed her something. "I think it matters to both of them for that reason." Ethan hadn't thought about it in those terms. He considered it now. "Yeah," he said. "Probably. Noah's good at choosing things that matter," she said. "He doesn't do it consciously, but he picks the right things." "He gets that from his mother," Ethan said. "It came out without calculation." He said things about Sarah sometimes now, without the careful pre-processing he'd once needed, not often, not heavily, but when it was true, he said it. She could walk into a room and know immediately what the most important thing in it was. Not the biggest thing or the loudest, the most important. Vivian looked at him. "Lila's like that too," he said. She walked across an entire restaurant and found the person who needed her most. Vivian was quiet for a moment. "She found you, yeah." He looked at his coffee. She did. There was a specific quality to the silence that followed, not empty, not comfortable in the uncomplicated way, but dense with things that were present and recognized without being named. They'd been in this particular space for weeks now, maybe longer. Space after the pretending that it was just dinner, just the kids, just practical convenience. The space before whatever came next. Vivian was the one who moved into it. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice was in the flat register she used for important things. "And I'm going to say it plainly, because I've been managing the way I say it for about 6 weeks, and I'm tired of it." Turned to look at her. She stopped. Tried again. "I have another stop." She exhaled. "You matter to me," she said. "In a way that's not about the kids, and not about being grateful, and not about filling some gap. You matter to me the way a person matters. And I haven't said it because I'm very good at constructing reasons not to say things, and I've run through all of them, and they're not good enough." Ethan held her gaze. "That's it," she said. "That's all. You don't have to." "Vivian." He said her name the way he said things he meant. "I know," she looked at him. "I've known for a while," he said. "And you didn't. I was waiting for you to get there on your own." He said it without judgment, without satisfaction. Just fact. You don't do well with being pushed to things. He blinked. "That's extremely accurate, and I find it slightly irritating." "I know that too." Across the kitchen, Noah said something that made Lila laugh, the real one, the full-body one, and the sound of it filled the space between them, and they both turned toward it by instinct, the way you turn toward warmth, without deciding to. When they looked back at each other, the something between them was still there. "This is," Vivian said, and then stopped and started over. "I don't know how to do this. I'm aware of that. I know how to run a company, and I know how to raise Lila, and I know how to handle things that need handling. I don't know how to," she gestured vaguely, "this." "I know," he said. "You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Are you scared?" He thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said, "not of you. Of getting it wrong. Of the distance between what I want it to be and what I'm actually capable of being, right now. That's the most honest thing you've said in 6 months." "I've been saying honest things for 6 months. You've been saying true things," she said. "That's different. True things are facts. Honest things are the ones that cost something." He looked at her. He thought about Voss telling him not to screw up whatever he had going. He thought about the drawer on the kitchen floor. He thought about being asked what the windows looked like and deciding to just describe the rain. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I decided that in January. I meant it for more than just the mission." Vivian looked at her hands on the table. "I know," she said, and this time it was her turn to use the word, and she said it in a way that meant she'd been carrying the knowledge of it, and hadn't been sure what to do with it, and was now, maybe, beginning to know. They sat in the kitchen, while the kids talked about the fountain, and the evening moved around them the way evenings do when nobody's rushing them. 3 weeks later, Lila had an appointment that the 4 of them all attended. This wasn't planned. Ethan had been dropping Vivian and Lila at the medical center the way he had for months, expecting to wait in the lobby. But Lila, coming through the apartment door in her coat and her yellow scarf. She'd been wearing yellow a lot lately, which Vivian thought was related to the fact that she'd started perceiving it differently, had said, very matter-of-factly, Ethan, are you coming in? He'd looked at Vivian. Vivian had looked at Lila. I want you both there, Lila said. And Noah can do homework in the waiting room. He doesn't mind. Noah confirmed that he didn't mind, so they went in. All four of them, Vivian and Ethan. Lila between them, Noah slightly behind with his backpack and his notebook, already calculating where the best chairs would be. The appointment was a milestone assessment. Dr. Hargreaves ran a series of tests that Lila had done before, so she knew the shape of them, and she was relaxed in the way she was always relaxed with preparation. Vivian sat in the corner of the examination room and didn't reach for Lila's hand. Ethan stood near the door with his arms crossed, watching, not in the tense way of someone bracing for bad news, but in the attentive way of someone who had learned that watching carefully was a form of respect. Dr. Hargreaves moved through the tests quietly. She was the kind of doctor who had learned to perform concentration without performing reassurance, which Lila appreciated, and Vivian had learned to trust. Then she brought out the light panel. It was a device Lila had interacted with at every assessment, a board of illuminated sections, colors and intensities and patterns that Lila was asked to describe. The first assessment, in December, Lila had perceived very little of it. Bright white sections, barely. The rest was absent. Now Dr. Hargreaves lit the board. Lila was quiet for a moment. There's more of it, she said. Her voice was careful, controlled, not excited, just careful the way she handled new information, the way she'd been protecting herself against wanting. Can you describe what you see? Dr. Hargreaves said. Lila's head moved slowly across the width of the board. The right side is brighter. There she stopped. There's something orange, or warm, something warm-colored on the left side. She paused. And in the middle, there's a shape. I don't know what shape. But there's something there. Dr. Hargreaves looked at her notes. She looked at the board. She looked at Vivian. Vivian was gripping the strap of her bag with both hands, which was what she did, instead of what her body wanted to do, which was make a sound she wouldn't be able to take back. Lila, Dr. Hargreaves said, the orange section is on the left. You identified it correctly. She paused. The shape in the middle is a circle. Lila absorbed this. I saw the circle, she said, as though she wasn't sure the word applied to her. You perceived it, Dr. Hargreaves said. Yes. Lila turned her face away from the board. She was looking at not Vivian's direction. She was looking toward Ethan. Ethan, she said. He came away from the door without being asked, crossed the examination room in a few steps, and crouched down to her level in the chair the way he always did when she was talking to him from a sitting position, because he'd noticed early on that she oriented more easily to voices that were at her height. Hey, he said, I saw a circle, she said. Her voice was still careful. Still protected against wanting too much. Yeah, he said.
You did.
She reached out in his direction and her hand found his forearm and she held it. Not tight. Just held it. The way she'd held his arm outside Harlow's restaurant on the first night. One small, certain contact. Can you tell me what the room looks like? She said. It was the question she'd been asking him since October. The same question, every new room. What does this look like? Tell me what's here. Ethan looked around the examination room, the light panel. Still illuminated, the doctor's desk and the notes spread across it. The window on the south wall, where the March sun was coming in at an angle that made the floor glow slightly. The way it does in early spring, when the light is still finding its angle. The room is small, he said, his voice the same as it always was when he answered unhurried. Specific, like he was giving her the real thing and not the simplified version. There's a window on your left and the sun's coming through it sideways. The floor's got a stripe of light across it, going from the window to about the middle of the room. He looked at the light panel. The board Dr. Hargreaves showed you it's still lit. The circle in the middle is white, surrounded by sections in green and orange. He paused. The orange is almost the color of the scarf you're wearing. Lila's hand was still on his arm. I want to try something, she said to the doctor. Dr. Hargreaves looked up, the stripe of light on the floor. Can I try to find it? The doctor glanced at Vivian, who nodded once, quickly, then pressed her lips together. Lila stood from the examination chair. She oriented herself shoulders square, head level, listening. Then she took 3 steps toward the south wall and stopped. She looked down. She turned her face slightly. She stood very still. Then she took 1 more step and stopped again. She looked down at her feet. "Is this it?" she said. "The stripe?" Ethan looked at the floor. Vivian had come out of her chair and was standing with one hand pressed flat against her sternum. Lila was standing in the stripe of sunlight. Her sneakers were lit up. Her jeans had a line of gold across the knee. She was standing in the exact center of the light coming through the window, and she'd found it herself, 3 steps and an adjustment, reading something she'd never been able to read before. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Vivian made the sound. She'd been holding it since the board, and it came out quietly, barely a sound at all. But it was the specific, involuntary sound of a person who has been holding on to something very tightly for a very long time, and has just, without warning, been able to put it down. Lila heard it. Of course she did. "Mom," she said. Not a question. Just the word. The name. The whole history of the 2 of them compressed into 1 syllable. Vivian crossed the examination room and put her arms around her daughter and held on, and Lila held back, and neither of them said anything else for a while. Ethan stayed where he was, half crouching on the examination room floor. He looked at the door, he looked at the window, and the stripe of light that ran across the floor and through the place where Lila was standing. He looked at his hands. He thought about the version of himself that had sat alone in a restaurant in October, watching rain on windows, eating the cheapest thing on the menu on his birthday because his friend hadn't come. He thought about how that evening had felt not tragic, just ordinary in the specific way of a life running below its own capacity, maintenance mode, surviving the week. He thought about a small hand touching an empty chair. He thought about being asked what the windows looked like. He stood up and went to the waiting room to tell Noah that his best friend had found the light. The ride home was quiet in a way that felt full rather than empty. Lila sat in the back with her yellow scarf and her eyes half closed, not sleeping, just processing. Noah sat beside her and didn't narrate anything for once, which was its own form of understanding, knowing when silence was the right description. Vivian drove. Her hands on the wheel were steady because she'd had 22 blocks to collect herself, and she was good at collecting herself, even when the thing she was collecting from was the best kind of thing. Ethan sat in the passenger seat and watched the city go by. After a while, Lila said, from the back, "The streetlights are different at night." Vivian glanced in the mirror. "Different how? They're more separate. During the day, the light is all together. At night, each one is its own thing." She paused. "I can see where one stops and another starts." Vivian focused on the road ahead. "That's new," Lila said. Not upset. Just noting it, the way you note a change in temperature. The way someone does who has learned to take the world in increments on its own terms, without demanding it arrive all at once. "Yeah," Ethan said, "that's new." Noah looked out his window. He was quiet for another block, and then he said, "I've been trying to count them." "Streetlights." "Since we got in the car, how many?" Lila said. "I lost count around 30. How far do you think they go?" "I don't know. Pretty far." Lila turned her face toward the window. "I want to count them too," she said. Someday, the car moved through the city. The streetlights continued, one after another, each one its own separate thing against the dark, going as far as any of them could see, and then further, into the parts of the city and the night that they hadn't reached yet, and would in time get to. Spring came the way it always does in this city, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week in late March, followed by a cold snap that made everyone feel personally betrayed. Then 2 weeks of rain that had the specific quality of rain that knows it's almost done, softer than winter rain, less committed. Then a Tuesday morning in the middle of April, when Ethan walked out to his truck and the air smelled like something had changed its mind about being cold, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment before getting in, because the morning deserved a moment. He was fixing the step outside Vivian's building that week. He'd finally gotten the materials together. It had taken longer than it should have, because he'd been particular about the concrete compound, wanting something that would hold in freeze-thaw cycles. And Gerald at the shop had told him twice he was overthinking it and he'd agreed and then kept being particular anyway. He went in the early mornings before his shift, while the building was still quiet, and worked in the pale April light while the city woke up around him. The building's super, a man named Tomas, who had been maintaining the property for 11 years and had developed strong opinions about everything within its walls, and most things outside them, came and stood behind him on the second morning and watched for a while.
"You're doing it right,"
Tomas said finally, with the tone of a man who had watched many people do many things wrong. "I've fixed a few steps," Ethan said. "Who asked you to do this?" "Nobody." Tomas looked at the step and then at Ethan and then back at the step. "You live here?" "No." Tomas considered this. "You're the mechanic," he said. Not a question. "Yeah." Miss Sterling's Tomas paused, in the way of someone choosing a word that fits without overcommitting. "Friend." "Yeah. The daughter calls you by your first name," Tomas said. "Since December," I noticed. Ethan smoothed the compound with the flat of his tool and didn't say anything. "It's a good step now," Tomas said, and went back inside. Ethan finished the step and went to work. He thought about what Tomas had said, not the part about the step, but the part about Lila calling him by his first name. He hadn't thought about when that had started. It had just started, the way most of the things between the four of them had started, without announcement, without any moment you could point to, just the gradual becoming of something that hadn't existed before. April was also when Lila started going to the park alone. Not entirely alone. Noah walked with her, and Vivian knew, and Ethan knew, and there had been a conversation about it that had lasted considerably longer than the logistics required, because the logistics were simple, and what was actually being discussed was something else. What was being discussed was whether Vivian could do this, let her daughter walk 3 blocks in a city she knew well with a boy who had been navigating those same 3 blocks for 2 years. Lila had presented the proposal the way she presented most things she wanted, directly, with the evidence already assembled, leaving Vivian's objections nowhere to go. "Noah's going anyway," she said. "It's 3 blocks. I know them. He knows them. I've walked them with you 40 times. With me," Vivian said. "And now I want to walk them with Noah." Vivian looked at Ethan, who was sitting at the counter, specifically not contributing to the conversation in a way that communicated his position without him having to take it. "You're not going to help me," she said. "I'm staying out of it," he said. "That is helping her." "I'm staying out of it," he said again, and drank his coffee. Vivian had looked at her daughter for a long moment. Lila stood in the kitchen doorway with the particular patient straightness she had. When she was waiting for an answer, she was fairly confident she already knew. She was wearing the yellow scarf, even though April was warm enough not to need it. She'd been wearing it almost every day since March, since the stripe of light on the examination room floor, and Vivian had not asked why, because she thought she understood. 3 blocks, Vivian said. 3 blocks, Lila said. "You text me when you get there, Mom. That is the condition. Non-negotiable." Lila didn't argue because she was good at identifying the things that were actually non-negotiable versus the things that were negotiable and presented as non-negotiable. She texted when she got there. She texted a single word fountain, which was more than enough and also somehow perfectly Lila. Vivian stood in her kitchen after receiving it and held her phone and let the feeling be what it was: fear and pride and love, and the specific ache of watching something you've held very tightly begin, correctly and inevitably, to move away from your hands. She texted back, "Thank you." Lila didn't respond, which meant she was already listening to the water. The treatment reached its assessment milestone in late April. Dr. Hargreaves scheduled a comprehensive evaluation, several hours of testing, more thorough than anything they'd done since the beginning. Lila went in on a Thursday morning and came out on a Thursday afternoon, and the 4 of them, because it was all 4 of them by now, without discussion, the same way everything was sat in Hargreaves's office while the doctor went through the results. She was careful. She was always careful. She laid out what the data showed without inflation, without the soft peddling that doctors sometimes did when they were uncertain about how much hope a family could carry. The changes were measurable and real. Light perception significantly improved. Color differentiation beginning to emerge, not fully, not reliably, but present in a way the baseline had not shown. Peripheral awareness developing in the left field. The circle on the board, which Lila had perceived in March as a vague shape, She had described in today's testing with an accuracy that had made the technician look twice at her chart. It was not a cure. Hargreaves was clear about that. The range of vision Lila would ultimately develop was still unknown. There was more treatment ahead, more assessment, more of the slow, incremental work of something changing at a pace the body could sustain. But it was real, and it was continuing. Lila sat through the summary with her hands in her lap, and her face turned toward the doctor, and when Hargreaves finished, she said, "What's next?" Hargreaves looked at her for a moment with the expression of a doctor who had treated many patients and not always had good news for them. "Phase 3, she said. "More of the same, mostly. More time." "I'm okay with time," Lila said. Vivian was sitting very still beside her. Ethan had his elbow on the arm of his chair and his hand over his mouth, the position he had when he was feeling something he hadn't decided how to handle yet. Noah was on the other side of Lila, and he said, without any particular drama, "I told you the circle was white." Lila turned toward his voice. "I said it was white." "You said it was probably white. That's still white. Uncertain white, Noah. I'm just saying." "Thank you." Lila said, the way she said it when she meant it, and also meant stop, and Noah stopped, and something in the room that had been holding itself carefully finally exhaled. May arrived, and the city remembered how to be warm. Ethan opened the center in the first week of May. It had been in the works since February, the space on Harrow Street that had been a machine shop for 30 years before the owner retired and the building sat empty, which Ethan had noticed during a job drive-by and then not been able to stop thinking about. It was the right size, the right layout. The ventilation was wrong, but fixable. The electrical needed updating. The floor was concrete and scarred and perfect. He'd been working on the business plan in the evenings since January, the same evenings he'd spent at Vivian's kitchen table, which meant she'd seen the drafts evolving over 3 months and had made exactly one unsolicited suggestion about the financial model, and the suggestion had been correct. And he'd made the change without acknowledging it verbally, and she'd accepted this without comment, which was a form of fluency they'd developed. He called it Carter's. Not Carter Veteran Services, not the Carter Center for Training, not anything that put the mission in the name and told you what you were supposed to feel about it. Just Carter's, because it was his name and his shop, and you could come there and learn to work on motorcycles and learn to work on yourself, and nobody was going to make a poster about it. He hired 2 people, a veteran named Delia, who had been out for 3 years, and was the best small engine mechanic he'd met since his uncle's shop, and a man named Raphael, who had aged out of foster care at 18 and spent 4 years afterward learning every job he could find and keeping none of them, and who had shown up at the garage on Calloway Street in March asking about work. Ethan hadn't had work for him there. He'd taken his number. Called him in April. Gerald at the old shop had shaken his hand when Ethan told him he was leaving. "I knew you were going to do something, eventually," Gerald said. "I wasn't planning this," Ethan said. "That's why it'll work," Gerald said. On the day they opened not a grand opening, just an open door and a few people who'd heard about it through Delia's network, and Raphael's Vivian and Lila and Noah were there. Vivian had brought coffee from a place 3 blocks away. Noah had made a sign that said Carter's in large, precise letters and hung it on the wall himself, standing on a step stool, checking 3 times that it was level. Lila stood in the center of the space and turned slowly. "It smells like the garage," she said, "but bigger." "It is bigger," Ethan said. "It smells like something starting." She tilted her head. "Is that the motorcycle?" "The Honda." "Yeah. Finished it last week." "Can I touch it?" He walked her over to it. The Honda sat in the center of the space on a cloth, a 1982 CB750 that had come to him as a collection of problems and was now, after 8 months of patient Sundays, a motorcycle that ran. He guided her hand to the tank, and she ran her fingers along the curve of it with the careful attention she gave things that deserved it. "Smooth," she said, mostly. He pointed to a place on the rear fender. "There's a small dent there I couldn't fully work out. I almost didn't keep it. Then I decided it was more honest with it." Lila found the dent with her fingertip. "I like it," she said. "It means someone wrote it." He looked at the bike. "Yeah," he said, "it does." Vivian was standing nearby, watching. She'd been watching Ethan in this space all morning with the attention she gave things she wanted to understand thoroughly. She watched him move around the shop, pointing out the layout to the two people who'd come in, explaining the workbench configuration, talking through what the first month was going to look like. He was the same as he was everywhere, which was the thing about him she'd needed the most time to trust. He didn't perform anything. The man at the dinner table and the man in the shop and the man in the examination room, crouching down to Lila's level, were the same man, without seams. She'd known people who were good in rooms. She'd known people who were good at presenting a version of themselves that answered what the room required. She'd built a career around reading those versions and deciding which ones to trust. Ethan didn't have a version. He just had himself, and some days that was difficult, and some days it was steady, and most days it was both, and it was always real. She was still learning to trust real. It was, she'd decided, worth the learning. After the last of the visitors had left and Delia was locking up, and Raphael was sweeping the floor with the thoroughness of someone who understood that taking care of a space is how you show you intend to stay, Vivian found Ethan in the back of the shop, standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at the Honda. "How does it feel?" she said. He thought about it honestly, which he always did. "Strange," he said. "Good strange. Like I've been carrying something a long way and just put it down, and now I'm not sure what to do with my hands." She looked at his hands, which were in his pockets. "I recognize that feeling. I know you do." She stood beside him and looked at the motorcycle. "It's a good thing, Ethan. What you're building here. We'll see. You always say that. Because I've seen too many things that looked good at the start. This one's different. What makes you sure?" She looked at him. "Because you're not doing it to prove something. You're doing it because it's the right thing to do with what you know." She paused. "That's the only reason anything actually works." He looked at her. "You sound like someone who's figured something out," he said. "I'm working on it," she said. "I'm in the intermediate stage." He almost smiled. "You're past the intermediate stage." "I'll tell you when I'm past the intermediate stage." They stood in the shop while Raphael swept, and the May evening came in through the open door at the front, and the Honda sat in the center of the space with its small, honest dent, and the sign that said Carter's hung level on the wall. The summer was imperfect in the specific way of summers that are actually lived. Noah grew an inch and a half and was furious about it in the way of a boy who had been the same height as Leela and was now not, and who had apparently made more of a point of that equality than he'd realized until it was gone. Lila thought this was funny. She told him height didn't mean anything, and he said she only thought that because she hadn't noticed him being taller, and she said she'd noticed, she just hadn't cared, and he sulked for approximately a day and a half and then forgot about it. Lila's treatment continued through July. The progress was not linear. Some weeks were more productive than others, and there were 2 weeks in June when nothing seemed to be improving, and Hargreaves spoke in the calm, measured way she always spoke, and Vivian listened and took notes, and went home and sat in her office and was very still for a while. Ethan called that evening, not because he knew she hadn't told him yet, but because he'd gotten in the habit of calling on Thursday evenings, and Thursday was Thursday. She told him. He listened. He didn't say it was going to be fine, because he didn't know if it was going to be fine, and she would have heard the uncertainty underneath a reassurance, and it would have been worse than the truth. 2 weeks isn't the story, he said. I know, it's just 2 weeks. I know. Are you okay? She thought about this. I'm in it, she said. That's all. I'm in it without trying to get ahead of it. That's good. It doesn't feel good. It feels like standing in the middle of something with no walls to hold. Yeah, he said. That's what it feels like when you stop trying to control it. When does it feel better? I don't think it feels better, he said. I think you just get more used to standing in the middle without needing the walls. She sat with that. That's not very comforting, she said. No, he agreed. But it's true. She laughed a short, genuine sound that surprised her. You're the only person I know who can be completely unhelpful and exactly right at the same time. It's a skill, he said. She went to bed that night without having fixed anything or arranged anything or gotten ahead of anything, and she lay in the dark and thought about standing in the middle with no walls, and it was not comfortable, but it was honest. And in the morning the sun came in through the window at the angle it always did, and the city started up its ordinary noise, and Lila was in the kitchen eating cereal and talking to someone on the phone, Noah. It was always Noah, and the day was just a day, waiting to be lived. 2 difficult weeks passed. The following assessment showed measurable progress again. October came, and with it, an anniversary that nobody had formally declared, but everyone quietly knew. 1 year since Harlow's. 1 year since a rainy Friday evening when a small girl in a yellow dress had crossed a restaurant full of strangers and touched an empty chair and asked a lonely man if she could eat dinner with him. Nobody planned anything. This was deliberate. Because the four of them had developed a collective allergy to occasions that were too arranged, too anticipated, too loaded in advance with the weight of what they were supposed to mean. Meaning had a way of showing up on its own when you weren't building a stage for it. But Vivian had made a reservation at Harlow's. She told Ethan on the Thursday before. Just mentioned it in the kitchen, over coffee, the way she mentioned things she'd decided. Friday, she said. Harlow's, 7 o'clock. He looked at her. I know, she said. He looked at his coffee cup. We don't have to make it into anything, she said. Just dinner. The same table if they'll give it to us. The same restaurant. He was quiet for a moment. Lila, no? She asked me to make the reservation. He looked up. She came to me last week, Vivian said, and said she'd been thinking about the restaurant where she met you, and she wanted to go back. That's all she said. I called and got the same table. She paused. She didn't know it was the anniversary. She just wanted to go back. Ethan was quiet. She knows more than we think she does, Vivian said. She always has, he said. They arrived at Harlow's at 7 on a Friday in October. The restaurant was the same, the low lighting, the white tablecloths, the jazz coming through the speakers, the tall windows that ran with rain because it was raining, which nobody had planned but which felt somehow correct. The corner table was theirs. The host seated them without ceremony and left them with menus. Lila sat in the chair where she'd sat the first night. She was in a yellow dress, she'd worn it deliberately. Vivian knew, the way Lila did everything deliberately, even the things that looked like impulse. Her hair was different than it had been a year ago, longer, worn down tonight rather than pulled back. She was 9 now, not 8. She held herself with the particular ease of someone who has been many places and found that most of them are navigable. Her vision was not normal. It would not be normal. This had been established over the course of 10 months of treatment and assessment, and the specific education of learning what was possible and being honest about what wasn't. She had light perception significantly beyond where she'd started. She had color awareness that was partial and unreliable and sometimes, on good days, startling. She could read shapes in good light at close range. She could find a stripe of sunlight on a floor. She could see, from across a kitchen, that the lamp in the corner was on. She could not see faces clearly. She could not read print. She could not make out the expression on someone's face across a restaurant. But she could, on this October evening, look toward the window and see the orange blur of the streetlight outside through the rain-blurred glass, and know it was orange, and know it was a light, and know it was outside. She told Noah this at the table, and he said the streetlights. You were going to count them. I counted some this summer, she said. On the walk to the park? Yeah. How many to the park? 11. 12 if you count the one on the corner that's always half out. Noah looked at her. He looked at her sometimes in a way that he didn't look at anything else, with the full, unguarded attention of someone who is watching something he never takes for granted. I'm counting them now too, he said. How many so far? He looked toward the windows. We came in from the left. I saw 4 on the way. He looked at the window nearest to them. There's one just outside. Lila turned her face toward the window. From where she sat, through the rain-blurred glass, there was a light. Orange hazy, one specific thing against the dark. I see it, she said. Noah looked at her. She turned back to the table. Her face was doing the careful, contained thing it did when something mattered enough that she was protecting it, holding it close, not letting it spill before she'd decided what it was. 5, she said. He nodded. 5. Across the table, Vivian had been watching this exchange in the way she'd learned to watch things without intervening, without narrating it, without making it into something it needed her help to be. She'd gotten better at this over the year. Not good. Better. The impulse to reach in was still there. It would always be there, but she'd learned to let it pass through her and keep her hands in her lap. She looked at Ethan. He was already looking at her. He'd been doing that more this year, catching each other looking, neither of them, pretending they hadn't been. It was one of the small privacies they'd developed, this fluency of looking, the shorthand of two people who had spent enough time together to stop requiring everything to be said. Their relationship had not been cinematic. This was something Vivian had needed to adjust to, because she'd spent enough years watching how other people's significant relationships were supposed to look that she'd developed an expectation she hadn't examined until it was being contradicted. There had been no declaration, no scene in the rain well. There had been rain, there was rain most of the important evenings, but it had just been weather, not metaphor. There had been conversations in the kitchen that lasted past midnight. There had been a Saturday in July when Lila had her appointment and Noah was at a friend's house, and Ethan and Vivian had gone for a walk in the park and stayed for 2 hours. Just walking, not talking constantly, and when they came back to the building, she'd taken his hand on the front steps and he'd held it. They'd stood there for a while before going inside, and neither of them had said anything about it. That had been the thing. That had been the moment, if there was a moment, which there wasn't really, which was the whole point. They weren't performing anything. They were just there, in the middle of it, without walls. The dinner moved the way good dinners move when everyone at the table knows each other well enough. That silence isn't a problem. They ordered, they ate. The jazz played. The rain ran down the tall windows and made the streetlights blur, in the way that had made Ethan say, a year ago, blurry, like someone took everything outside and smeared it. Lila asked Noah to describe the restaurant again. She'd heard it the first time she'd built the room from Ethan's words that October evening and had been carrying it for a year, but she wanted to hear it again from Noah to see how it had changed. He described it seriously, with the care he gave to things she asked. He told her about the tables and the lighting and the couple in the corner who were celebrating something. There was a small cake that had appeared at their table. He told her about the server who kept tugging at his collar, which he did every time he came out of the kitchen. He told her about the window and the rain and the specific color of the streetlight outside orange, with a white center, he said, bright enough to see even through water. Lila listened to all of it. Then she said, "Is the same table still in the corner?" Everyone looked at the corner table. The restaurant was full tonight. Corner table had a couple sitting at it, middle-aged, talking quietly over wine. Same table, Vivian said. Different people. Lila nodded slowly. I'm glad, she said. Vivian looked at her. Glad about what? That someone else is sitting there. Lila tilted her head slightly. It's good when a table doesn't stay empty. The table was quiet for a moment. Ethan looked at his glass. He thought about the man who had sat at that corner table a year ago, who had eaten the cheapest thing on the menu alone on his birthday, who had spent so long in maintenance mode that he'd stopped noticing the difference between that and living, who had trained himself to want so little from any room he walked into that he'd stopped feeling the wanting. He thought about what it had taken to undo that. Not one thing. Not one moment. A year of small things, imperfect things, difficult, honest things said in kitchens at 11 at night. A year of 4 people choosing, over and over, to keep showing up. Lila, he said. She turned toward his voice with the accuracy she'd always had, the internal compass that had never failed her even before the treatment gave her any light to work with. Why did you sit with me, he said, that night? The real reason. She thought about it. She took her time the way she always did with real questions. You were quiet, she said. Not the quiet that means someone doesn't want to talk. Quiet that means someone doesn't have anyone to talk to. She paused. I know the difference. I've always been able to hear it. He held her gaze, or what passed for a gaze. Her face turned toward him with its particular attentiveness, the dark eyes that couldn't see his face clearly but were looking at him in every way that mattered. You sounded like someone who had run out of people, she said. And I hadn't. Vivian pressed her lips together, so I brought some, Lila said. And she said it simply, without drama, the way she said most things that were true. Noah picked up his water glass. That's the most Lila thing I've ever heard you say, he said. Lila smiled. I know. Ethan laughed, a real one. The kind that happens before you decide whether to let it. That starts somewhere low and comes out without your permission. He laughed. And Noah laughed because Ethan laughing was still a slightly rare thing. and it was worth responding to, and Vivian laughed. And Lila sat in her chair in her yellow dress, with her hand near Ethan's on the table, and looked pleased in the way of someone who has accomplished exactly what she set out to do. Later, walking out of the restaurant, Vivian and Ethan a few steps behind the kids, she reached for his hand in the way she'd reached for it on the building steps in July, without announcement, without making anything of it. Took it. The rain had lightened to a mist, the kind that doesn't really fall so much as exist in the air, that you only feel when you walk through it. Lila had her yellow scarf. Noah had his hands in his pockets. They were walking slightly ahead, already in conversation about something in the restaurant, the cake at the other table, logistics of getting home. Vivian watched them and thought about all the things she'd tried to control over the years that had mattered, and all the things she'd tried to control that hadn't, and how hard it had been to tell the difference, and how much she still sometimes got it wrong, and how she was learning, slowly, to let the getting it wrong be part of the thing rather than evidence against it. She'd spent 8 years building walls. She'd spent this year learning that walls keep out the weather and also the light, and that you cannot have one without the other, and that the question is whether the thing you're trying to keep out is worth losing the light for. She had decided it was not. "Hey," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Stop thinking so hard," he said. "We're taking a walk." "I'm always thinking this hard, I know. But sometimes it helps to just walk." She looked at the street ahead, the mist, the kids, who had paused at the corner to wait for them, Noah counting streetlights under his breath, and Lila listening to him do it, both of them perfectly ordinary and perfectly themselves. "Okay," she said. She walked. There is something that people don't tell you about rebuilding a life, that it doesn't happen in the moments you expect, the dramatic ones, the ones you'd write down if someone asked you to explain how things changed. It happens in the accumulated weight of ordinary evenings. It happens in kitchens, in parking lots, in the seats of cars going home from medical appointments. It happens when someone describes the rain for you because you asked, or when you fix a drawer at 11 at night because the fixing is the thing you can do, or when a 9-year-old counts streetlights out loud because his best friend wants to know how many there are. Ethan Carter spent 12 years learning to survive things. It was a skill he was very good at, and it had cost him in ways he was still accounting for. The man who came home from that, who learned to make lunches and fix cars and not reach for anything that might reach, back had been doing the work of survival without noticing that survival and living are not the same weight class. What changed was not dramatic. What changed was a child who heard something in his silence and decided to sit down. Vivian Sterling spent 8 years building a life so managed, so thoroughly defended, that the only thing that could get through it was the thing she'd built it for her daughter. The irony being that it was her daughter who finally showed her where the wall was. Not by breaking through it. By walking around it calmly, in a yellow dress, toward the person on the other side. The lesson, if there is one and maybe there isn't. Maybe these things are too specific to become lessons and too human to reduce to something you could put on a card, is something like this. That the people who need us most are not always the ones asking loudly. That the loneliest man in a room is not always the one making the most noise about it. That a child without sight can sometimes see more clearly than the adults around her, because she's learned that you don't always need your eyes to understand what's in front of you. And that the table you set for yourself, alone the corner table, the single chair, the menu you study, because you have nothing else to look at, is not a permanent arrangement. It is just the room as it is right now, waiting for whoever it is that's coming. They are usually already there. You just haven't looked in the right direction. The Honda ran well that fall. Ethan took it out on Sunday mornings sometimes, early, before the city got busy, when the streets were still mostly clear, and the light was the low amber of a morning that hadn't decided anything yet. He rode it the way he'd rebuilt it carefully, without hurry, paying attention to what it was doing rather than where it was going. He'd taken Lila to the shop once to hear it start. She'd stood beside it with her hand on the tank and felt the engine turn over the vibration of it, moving up through the metal and into her palm, and she'd said it sounded like something that had been waiting. He thought about that sometimes, on Sunday mornings, riding the bike through the quiet city. Carter's was 6 months old by November and had 11 regular participants, 5 veterans, 4 foster care graduates, 2 who were both. Delia taught 2 mornings a week. Raphael had turned out to have a gift for explaining things that he hadn't known about himself, a quality that made him better with the younger participants than Ethan in certain ways, which Ethan told him directly, and Raphael didn't believe for about a month and then started to. The center was not profitable. It was not meant to be. It was funded by a combination of a small grant Ethan had written himself badly, the first draft, and then better after Vivian read it and handed it back with 9 specific notes, none of which she described as corrections and individual donations, and Vivian's quiet involvement, which was not advertised, because Ethan had asked her not to advertise it, and she'd respected that. She'd also fixed the ventilation system. He'd come in one morning to find Tamaj somehow. Inexplicably, Vivian had found and enlisted Tamaj supervising 2 people replacing the ventilation units, working from a spec sheet that had clearly been prepared by someone who knew what the right thing was and had obtained it. He'd looked at Tomas, and Tomas had shrugged with the magnificent indifference of a man who does what the building requires and doesn't explain himself. Called Vivian. The ventilation was wrong, she said. I know. I was going to get to it. It needed to be done before winter. You could have asked me. I did. In August. You said you'd look at it. Thought back. I said I'd look at it, he said. That's not the same as Ethan. Yeah, the ventilation is fixed. He stood in the center of the shop with the phone to his ear and the new ventilation units working quietly above him. The air was already different. He'd been in rooms with bad air for long enough that the quality of good air was something he noticed with his whole body. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, she said, and moved on to something else. He stood there a minute longer before he did too. In November, on a Saturday morning that had the particular clear cold of a sky that had finally made up its mind, Noah and Lila walked to the park together and sat beside the fountain. The fountain ran quieter in November. The city reduced the flow as the temperature dropped, to reduce the freeze risk, but it ran. The water had a low, steady voice instead of the full-throated sound of summer, and Lila had mentioned that she preferred it this way, that the quieter version was easier to think inside of. They sat on the edge, and Noah described the park to her the way he always did, and she listened the way she always did, and after a while they weren't talking about the park anymore. They were just talking. The way they did, the rambling way of 2 kids who have enough history together that the conversation doesn't need to go anywhere in particular. Do you think they'll get married? Noah said. Who? Your mom and my dad. Lila thought about this seriously. I don't know. Probably eventually. Would that be weird? Thought about it. We'd be sort of siblings. Sort of. I don't think that's weird. Me neither. He picked up a pebble and turned it over in his fingers. I'd want to know in advance, though, so I could prepare. Prepare for what? I don't know. Things that need preparing for. Lila reached out and felt the edge of the fountain. Stone was cold and slightly damp. I think they're scared of rushing, she said. They're not rushing anything, Noah said. I know. They're the least rushing people I know. She paused. I think that's okay. Some things don't need rushing. Noah dropped the pebble into the fountain. They both listened to the small sound it made, the plunk of something entering water, then the ripples, then the fountain resuming its quiet November voice. Remember the first time we came here? Noah said. Yes. You put your hand in the mist, I remember. And I counted a pigeon. He left before I could hear him properly. He came back, Noah said. Not the same one. But there's always a pigeon. Lila smiled. That's philosophical. I didn't mean it that way. I know. That's what makes it philosophical. Noah looked at the fountain. He thought about September, 14 months ago, sitting at a dinner table in a restaurant he'd never been to before, with a girl he'd just met who couldn't see him, who had asked him what the restaurant looked like before she'd asked his name. He thought about how he'd answered without thinking about it, the way you answer when the question is obvious, when there's no reason not to. He thought about how answering that question had made him someone who noticed things better than he had before, because you pay better attention to the world when someone is counting on you to bring it back faithfully. He thought about his mother. He did that sometimes. Without warning, without the sadness being the whole thing, just the thought of her, the specific details of her that Lila had asked him once to describe. The way she sang songs wrong on purpose, the smell of the coffee she made. The laugh that came out of nowhere when something surprised her. Kept those things. He would always keep them. They didn't go anywhere. They just found their place beside everything else that was true. I'm glad we came here that first time, he said. You brought me, Lila said.
Yeah.
It was a good idea. I have some good ideas. Don't push it. He laughed, and the sound of it went out over the water and the park and the cold November morning, and Lila heard it, and that was enough, and the fountain ran on quietly, and somewhere in the city, 4 people were living their imperfect, continuing lives, going to work and cooking breakfast and worrying about things that might not happen, and sometimes failing at the things they'd promised themselves they'd do better, and loving each other in the specific, unsentimental, everyday way that is not a feeling so much as a decision, made again and again, without ceremony, in the ordinary rooms where most of life actually happens. The table was never empty, not anymore, and in the end, that was all the story was. 2 people who had run out of something: hope, company, the belief that anything was still coming toward them, and the children who understood, before the adults could, that the right response to an empty chair is not to look away from it. It is to pull it out and sit down